Hello everybody, so this is part 2 of me reviewing all of the films nominated for the 95th Academy Award, with the exception of documentaries and short films. Last week I explained things in a bit more detail when I did part 1 of this series, so you are welcome to check that out. It doesn't really matter whether you watch part 1 first. One thing I didn't mention at the start of part 1 is that the order here is completely random. With that said, let's jump in. Right, so EO is like Warhorse, but worse because it's about donkeys and donkeys are boring. I'm joking, it's actually a pretty interesting movie. I'd just say it's like Warhorse because it follows the story of a donkey who basically gets passed around from person to person while we get little snippets of the drama in their life. The title EO is presumably referring to the noise donkeys make. I mean, someone from Northern England would pronounce the standard English word Eeyore very much the same. Eeyore. Anyway, I guess I should tell you the sequence of events that happen. This movie is very short, by the way, so it won't take too long to just recount things. First of all, the donkey is at the circus, but then some animal rights protesters show up and the donkey is taken to a farm. It is a bit weird that animal rights protesters seem to immediately lead to the circus getting rid of all their animals. You'd think they'd be resistant to that. So then at the farm, they realise that he's not very competent, I guess, so they just abandon him in the middle of nowhere. He then gets picked up and taken to a sanctuary where he's used as a therapy animal for children with Down syndrome. It's pretty cute. Also at this point, the woman he worked with at the circus shows up and pets him and gets him a carrot cake for his birthday. It's a bit weird she is reintroduced here because subsequent to this she has no more presence in the film. Also, I got so used to the fact we were following a nameless donkey that when people showed up and started speaking Polish, it took me a while to actually realise words were being said and to check the subtitles. I haven't mentioned yet this is a foreign language film, but I mean it's definitely a foreign language film for people who hate reading because it's mostly told from the perspective of a donkey, so there's very little dialogue here. Anyway, so I guess because he misses his owner, he decides to run away, which was a bad move, honestly, because this Down syndrome petting zoo was probably the best possible outcome for it, especially since it then just wanders around town and gets escorted out by some firemen. I have heard that because fire safety standards are much better nowadays, firemen end up doing a lot of jobs other than stopping fires. But then, in one of the weirdest moments of the film, they just dump this donkey off on the side of a football pitch where they appear to be playing Sunday League football. At least I hope it's Sunday League football. The pitch doesn't exactly look to be maintained to a high standard, although maybe that's just Poland for you. Their national stadium is probably just a field with a bench next to it. But yeah, it's really bizarre the firemen just leave him there and like, yes, our work is done. So then, one football team ends up winning, and they adopt the donkey as their mascot because he just randomly showed up while they were winning the match. They also have a chant which was translated as, "We're the winners, losing is for wieners." I hope that sounds better in Polish, because in English that chant sounds very lame. Anyway, at this point it gets sad, because while they're celebrating that evening, some hooligans from the rival team show up and trash their bar, and then, just because the donkey is wearing a scarf for their team, the hooligans beat it with a baseball bat. Yeah, that's pretty disgusting, obviously. That's what a load of beer and a stupidly zealous commitment to a football team will do to someone's morality, I guess. Poor donkey. So then it gets picked up by an animal hospital who nurse it back to health, but I guess because it's a little traumatized, it kicks a guy in the face and is taken away. At this point, they decide to take it to the dog food factory. Good luck getting a donkey to eat dog food. At this point, they decide to take a trip to the glue factory, and he isn't allowed to come. I'm just kidding, those are Simpsons references, but I think it's implied the donkey is being taken to a slaughterhouse. In fact, I think to a salami making place, because today I learned that salami is made from delicious, delicious donkey meat. So then something strange happens. The trucker decides to give this woman a load of food when he stopped at a gas station. I assumed she was a prostitute, but then he jokingly says, after he's given her some food, "Now sex," and she runs away, and then he gets stabbed in the throat. I don't really know what happened. Like, was the woman and the attacker in cahoots? Or is it a coincidence? Was the attack for some kind of purpose? Or just a random act of violence? You think maybe it's to steal the contents of his truck, but they don't steal the donkey. Instead, the donkey gets picked up by a random, disgraced priest who happens to be driving by. We get an insight into this weird quasi-incestuous relationship this priest has with his stepmother, I think. Cool, whatever. And then, I think I might have zoned out because the next thing I know, he's back at the salami factory and gets killed so he can be turned into salami. Like I say, should have stayed at the Down syndrome petting zoo. Now that's a band name. I do like that this film is told from the perspective of a donkey. It makes it more technically impressive that they were able to tell something that felt like an actual story without having, an actual actor. I also think it's endearing how this donkey just has a big dumb face for the entire thing. There's something kind of cute about the vacant expression animals have. I did of course find it really upsetting when he gets beaten up by those random hoodlums. Like, that can piss off. But also the fact so much of this film is just him moving from place to place makes it really hard to get attached to the moment. Like, yeah, I was thinking, oh, that's sad, but I was also thinking, okay, so this is how they move him onto the next part of his journey where he's probably going to be rescued by someone. Interestingly, I didn't find the ending of the movie especially sad at all though, because I'm not one of those contemptible, hypocritical meat-eaters who acts like it's a tragedy to see animals being killed for food, but then eats that double bacon cheeseburger from McDonald's without a second thought. No, I eat meat and don't have a moral problem with animals being killed for their meat, so I don't have an emotional reaction to seeing an animal being painlessly killed at the end. Also, the very fact this movie establishes the donkey just doesn't seem to be able to stay in one place made this almost feel like a relief. He finally achieved Nirvana and escaped the cycle of being passed off from one owner to another. Good for him. There was one weird moment where there's this random shot of a quadruped robot after the donkey gets beaten up. I don't know what this is supposed to symbolize or what the point of it is. It kind of just seems like it was a random artsy moment for the sake of being artsy, which, on that note, this movie also has a non-standard aspect ratio, because art. Overall, the thing with this film is that I wouldn't have that much interest in seeing it again. I actually don't think it had that much to it, but it is somewhat technically impressive and emotionally compelling. Middling 6. Okay, so Women Talking is a story about this sort of quasi-Amish cult where women don't have any rights and a large number of the men in the colony are habitually sexually assaulting them. Specifically, they're drugging them with tranquilizers and then having sex with them. And no algorithm's going to keep me from being very direct about what that is. Grape. They're graping them. So in response to this, every single woman in the colony gets together to decide whether they're going to stand and fight for their rights to be equal or to leave the colony. So right away, I have an issue with this movie, which is that it's so far beyond anything I can relate to that I struggle to get especially invested. This is a story where seemingly every single man is complicit in this systemic rape. Like, we're told that they were exclusively told by men that they were imagining these attacks, making it up, just trying to get attention. Now, I get that to an extent, this happens today in our current society, but there's a point at which a difference in magnitude becomes a difference in substance. Yes, sometimes victims of sexual assault aren't believed in mainstream society, and sometimes the actions of the abusers are minimized. That is all absolutely true. But when you say, well, what about a society where this is just happening all the time, blatantly, such that every single woman, and seemingly every single man, knows it's happening, but everyone just ignores it? At that point, you are creating a world with such a radically different frame of reference for appropriate behavior that it becomes impossible for me to really relate to it. Also, I don't know what kind of cult this is, but at first I was thinking, do they not even have the concept of marriage? Because apparently this is a society where any man can have sex with any woman whenever he wants. But actually, at least one woman is in fact married, so maybe there are a lot of married men here and they're all just massive cucks. I guess in a world where everyone's a cuck, nobody is. Also, just for context, we know that this is set in 2010. So this isn't in the past, it's just a society that is cut off from modern technology. We know this because entirely coincidentally, the exact day all this stuff is boiling over is also when the US government is conducting their once-a-decade census. What are the odds? So yeah, that's my first issue. I just can't relate to what's happening, not because I'm a man as opposed to a woman, but because I'm someone who doesn't live in an insane cult that has radically different standards of morality to anywhere else I'm aware of. But the second issue I have is this entire idea that every single woman just all gets together and decides to have this really frank, open dialogue about what to do in order to oppose this systemic oppression. The problem is, that doesn't ever actually happen, because the thing about systemic oppression is it's systemic and often internalized. I don't know if there has ever been an oppressed group in all of human history of whom it could be expected that every single member of that group in a given community would get together and all agree to just collectively organize to fight for their rights. Historically, women's rights has been always a small number of women fighting for whatever rights they're trying to get, while a lot of women just refuse to rock the boat, and many women actively want to keep things the way they are. And I'm saying that about the suffrage campaign in the early 20th century, back when many women were educated and connected to a legacy of radical political activism and could, read. In this society, on the other hand, we're told that all the women are illiterate, they are not allowed to be educated, and as such they would have literally no frame of reference for any kind of radical political movement. Also, they've been raised from birth to believe that outside of this cult, they will have no hope of entering the kingdom of God. So I just can't believe that something like this would ever happen. I can't believe that every single woman would one day decide to have this conversation where they all explicitly acknowledge their systemic oppression and just calmly theorize potential solutions. Now, I should say, there are some people who sort of oppose what they're doing. I say that, there's really only one woman who takes that stance, and she's also the only one who has a husband, and he's the one who happens to come back early while all the men are out so he can beat her up and then cause her to change her mind. Oh, and yeah, I say that all the men are out, that's because every single one of them decides to head into town to bail out the men who were arrested for the rapes. That's what I mean in saying they all seem to be okay with what's happening. If all the men are opposed to these perpetrators getting arrested, then how did they get arrested? Did the women somehow get in contact with the police? I'm not sure, we don't see. More to the point, it just seems a bit weird that in this society that is all about oppressing women, every single man would just decide to leave them completely unsupervised. I should say the film starts off explicitly saying, "What follows is an act of female imagination." I'm not entirely sure what this means. It could be just a way of stressing that this is not based on any specific cult, but it could also be a tacit acknowledgement that this sequence of events wouldn't actually realistically happen, that we're imagining a bunch of women taking this collective stance as a hypothetical. In my view, that still leaves the issue though that it's very difficult to relate to this emotionally if it's about human societies behaving in a way that seems totally contrary to how they actually do. I also think that if this is supposed to be a hypothetical exploration of themes, then it's actually not fantastic about that either, because of the title. It's women talking. Most of this is women just sat in a circle having a conversation about what they should do, and that makes any thematic insights this film presents pretty uninteresting because they're just saying them. Like, they discuss a lot of stuff. They discuss how they compare each other's trauma in an unhelpful way rather than acknowledging their own collective trauma. They discuss whether seeking a social explanation for the male violence absolves the men of moral responsibility for their actions. But I think I'm going to present as a universal rule that it's a problem for thematic movies to largely comprise of conversation scenes, because when characters are just talking about the themes, then it's not really a movie, it's a video essay. Conversations can be good if they're emotionally impactful, and some of these conversations are, but I'm not going to give this film much kudos for all the various aspects of gender studies it touches on when it's just characters talking about this stuff. Now, there are some thematic moments that aren't entirely just about conversation. One of these is that there's a character who has started identifying as a man after being impregnated by her own brother with a baby who was then stillborn. Lots of trauma there. Also, I'm surprised there wasn't a greater trans backlash to this film's blatant insinuation that trans identity in women emerges from experiencing trauma and seeking to escape it. Also, it's a bit interesting that this society of men who are super horrible to women are just perfectly happy to accept this one woman identifying as a man. Like, it seems to be that she for a while now has been presenting as a man, and these sexists are just like, "Sure thing, bro, anything you say." With that said, why don't these women just consider identifying as men? That seems to work. Anyway, my final major issue with the film is that the conversation they're having is sort of about nothing. It's actually a bit bizarre. See, the women are told that they are to forgive the rapists, or else they will be expelled from the colony. But then, the debate they end up having is whether they should leave the colony or stay and fight. Now, I don't know exactly what fight means here, but it presumably involves actually pushing for some sort of justice, and I don't imagine that would work with forgiving the men who perpetrated the injustice. So the point is that their choices are either leave the colony or stay and fight, in which case they will be forced to leave the colony, so what's the debate? And for that matter, it seems like the many women who want to leave could just leave. Why does this have to be a collective decision? Again, you'd think that cults are like high control environments, but this cult seems weirdly very chill with the one exception of the rampant rapes. But like, you'd think the men would forbid the women from leaving, rather than almost inviting them to leave. You'd think that they would try to control the women, rather than giving them some space to talk everything through. And seemingly, women actually have a lot of room to think independently, considering how many of them are already arriving at opposition to the way the society is organised before the movie even starts. Like, almost every single one of them is entering this conversation with avowed feminism as their central starting position. After a few hours of talking, they're already planning on drafting up a constitution to affirm their equal rights. I wonder how long this cult community has existed for. It's implied the grandmothers here grew up in it, but like, how can it actually have lasted this long with a policy of, we're going to systematically abuse half our population, but also give them complete freedom to discuss at length their issues with the way things are organised? And to really drive this home, there is one man they decide to leave with the women, and he is the one who is writing the meeting notes since he is literate, August, the child of a mother who was thrown out of the cult previously for being disobedient. So they were like, hey women, decide what you want to do, and just to help you, he is the only man in the entire colony who was raised outside of our cult by a woman who explicitly rejected our teachings. There's a point at which you think, did the men have a problem with the women or something? They almost seem to be wanting them to go. August is kind of interesting. He has a little romance thing with one of the women. He also has a lot of trauma, and at the end we find out he's suicidal, but he doesn't actually go through with it, and I choose to believe he won't after the story is over. Anyway, so, I realise I have mostly complained about this, because I just find the premise so silly. But actually, the movie isn't that bad. The production value is good with the costumes and stuff, the acting is all pretty good, and I respect the film for how intense it can be with some of the emotions of what's being portrayed. So this is probably the most negative criticism to praise ratio I've ever given a positive rating after, but I actually think this film is like a middling 6. It helps that it's quite short, so it's much easier to get through. Oh, also, the whole imagination caveat does help a lot, but overall, it doesn't entirely excuse just how much this film goes off the rails in terms of the social context of what's being presented. So, Marcel the Shell with shoes on has some good qualities. It's pretty cute. It's about this shell with shoes on, but he's like a little guy. He sounds a little bit like Adam Friedland's impression of Liberal Elmo, so that's good. We like cute things being cute, well done. The problem with the film is that it's boring. It is a very boring film where nothing happens of any interest whatsoever. So basically, it's like a mockumentary where there's this shell with shoes on who lives in the real world and this filmmaker is filming him. They actually have this whole thing where he puts the videos on YouTube, which I thought would go somewhere and it kind of didn't. Like all that happens is that at first they upload a video and they're like really shocked at getting 84 views because 84 whole people sat down and watched the video, and that's pretty endearing. But after a while, they have a video that gets several million views, and it all goes viral and people start TikToking and memeing and visiting his house. So yeah, this doesn't really go anywhere. This film most certainly is not about online fame or anything like that. In fact, after a while, the attention kind of disappears. It makes sense that this real-life shell with shoes on would become famous because of the novelty of it being real. You know, the implications for natural sciences are significant. The big problem is that from my perspective watching the movie, I know that it isn't actually real, so I expect a bit more than just this shell with shoes on to exist. It actually has to do something. For the most part, Marcel doesn't have any interesting conversations or insights. There are some small interesting moments, like when Marcel realizes how much bigger the world is than he first thought. He travels outside and is shocked by the size of the city he can see from the car, and is very shocked to discover that the actual world is orders of magnitude bigger. There was one moment that made me laugh. This film is not a comedy, where Marcel is asked how long it's been since he saw his parents, and he's like, I don't really count days the way you do. I just count the seasons and the sleepless nights and the emptiness of my heart or whatever. Like, he kind of responds in this poetic, nondescript way, and then they turn to his friend and they're like, so how long has it been? And he just flatly replies, 2 years. Anyway, yeah, so the main plot is that the shell guy lost his family when his old owners moved out, and he uses his online fame to try to crowdsource information to find out where they are. For some reason, this really doesn't work well until he goes on TV, because I guess network television has way more reach than the internet. But yeah, then he finds his family, so good. Also, in the meantime, the only person he has around is his grandma, but then she dies, so that was kind of sad, but you know, now he has the rest of his family, so it's fine, no big deal. A little bit like how I'm not sad about animals being killed for me, I'm usually not sad about grandparents dying, because, you know, it's their time to go. That's what happens when you're a grandparent. You die. Well, all my grandparents are still alive, and are great-grandparents, except for one. But even then, my grandmother remarried, so now I have a new granddad, so I'm saying this as someone who is a bit spoiled in terms of living older relatives. But absolutely, when my one granddad who did die, died, I wasn't especially sad about it at all, because yeah, that's life. You live and then you die. So I didn't find this film especially sad, I didn't find it funny, and the plot was incredibly thin. The cinematography and animation was kind of interesting. Like, it's an interesting combination of an unprofessional documentary style with then what I'm 99% sure was stop motion animation, but it might have been digital. One thing I will say is that this movie sort of felt like a commercial. Like, the fact it was set in a home, I expected the shell to be a mascot for a brand or something. Like, he stood on the sofa and I expected it to be like, I'm sat on this comfy sofa that's now half price at DFS, or, as a shell, I don't like to smell, that's why you should use this brand of fabric cleaner when you wash your sofas. That's quite a profound insult, but what I'm basically saying there is that this incredibly cute character combined with the faux authentic amateurish style left me feeling like I was being manipulated. I think at least the animation was unique for a movie. At first I was kind of intrigued by it, and the fluidity of the camera movement would presumably have made the animation hard, so it's technically impressive. But overall, the problem is that there's just so little to this movie and I was very bored, so I'm going to stop talking about it now. Simply because it was short and didn't waste too much of my time, I'm going to give this a low 5. But honestly, I've probably found lower rated films way more entertaining, and I'd have very little interest in ever watching this again. But whatever, at least it was kind of unique. Well done. Right, so my criticism of the last two movies has sort of been that they were boring. Not really that much happened, and I wasn't that invested. So next I watched Bardo, False Chronicle of a Handful of Truths, and it's a 2 hour and 40 minute long foreign language film. And right away, you can tell it's going to be a bit artsy. There's a lot of abstract imagery and scenes that don't really have a logical narrative purpose so much as they're just spectacle, and I was kind of thinking, oh no, is this going to be one of those artsy foreign films where basically nothing happens? And the answer is sort of no. See, there are moments where this movie is threatening to become interesting by being an artsy foreign film where lots of absurd and as such entertaining things happen. Like pretty early on, there's a reenactment of the Mexican-American War and it has like actual fighting in it, people being shot, cool stuff like that. So I'm like, yeah, this will be exciting, let's go. But it turns out actually this was just supposed to be like a commentary on the relationship between Mexicans and America. The movie has a lot of racial stuff in it, like the Mexicans are always complaining about gringos, and then Americans are minimizing the injustices done to Mexicans. There's a scene where the main character has a conversation with Hernan Cortez on top of a pile of dead Aztec bodies, and they debate whether the Spanish were civilized in contrast to the Aztecs. The thing is, despite these scenes, this movie isn't really on a deep level about like colonialism or anything. Instead, it's actually, I guess, a semi-autobiography from the director Iñárritu, who has made films I've really enjoyed before. But yeah, you can tell this because there's a lot of scenes discussing his art, especially the idea that his art is accessible to gringos in a way that constitutes a betrayal of his Mexican heritage. So yeah, that's the big focus here. A bit like The Fabelmans, this movie is a director reflecting on his life as a director. But then this kind of makes me more confused because then what is the point of all these scenes about Mexican history? Iñárritu has never made a single movie about Mexican history. But to see this movie, you'd think that the history of the Mexican people is a driving force of what motivates this guy to create art, because he's constantly returning back to it. Even more modern history, there's a scene where a load of dead bodies on the ground are talking, and this represents the people disappeared by the Mexican far-right dictatorship. It's actually quite a clever representation because we're told that those who were disappeared never died, but never lived either, which I guess makes sense. It would have really added something to Argentina 1985, but what does Iñárritu's body of work have to do with this topic? Are we supposed to believe that a knowledge of Mexican history influences him on a deeper level? How deep? Because I don't think any of his films even got close to being about this topic. There's also some other stuff relating to race and selling out. The two kind of go hand in hand because it's like he sold out his race for fame while all the other Mexicans are poor. One interesting scene is when he gets really mad at this guy at the American border for saying that the United States is not his home because he's on a visa rather than being a citizen. Like, he gets really mad about it and literally complains to the supervisor. And this is so funny to me because, yeah, US border guards are such dicks, even to white Anglophone guys like me. I can't imagine how awkward it would be if you're Mexican. But at the same time, I just keep my head down and don't say anything while they're treating me like a piece of dirt they found on the bottom of their shoe, because I know if I kick off, well, at this point, I could get shot. When he complains, he says, a guy like that shouldn't be the first face people see when they enter the country. And yeah, absolutely. Like, dude, I have such a negative opinion of America, largely because almost every single time I've entered it, the first person I've seen is someone who seems to want me dead. I feel like Americans don't realize how abnormal this is. Every other country, when you enter, they'll be like smiling, they'll ask how your flight was, how are you doing, welcome to the country. In America, it's like, who the hell are you to think you have any right to enter my country? Shut up. Like, straight up, the time before last I entered America, I said, I'm going to be visiting my wife's family. And the lady said, you shouldn't say you're going to be doing that, because it's up to me whether you get to do that. What a fucking psychopath bully, letting the institutional power she holds blatantly get to her head. But yeah, the thing is, as much as this annoys me, I wouldn't make a movie about it. My beef is that I don't think there's any substance here that really justifies making a movie about the topic. Best example of this is that there's this whole thing about his wife having a miscarriage. Like, at the start of the film, the baby crawls back into the mother's vagina, and they say, oh, it's because the world is too corrupt, he doesn't want to enter it. In the weirdest scene ever, he's going down on his wife, and the baby's head sticks out of her vagina, and I'm pretty sure he's like,
making out with the baby for a second. But yeah, obviously all of this is about how he's sad that his wife had a miscarriage, and they even have like a mock funeral thing towards the end, which I assume must have been decades later. And I say that because by the end of the film, they have 2 adult children, and like, are they not enough? I'm not saying that miscarriages are nothing, but I know many women who have had miscarriages, and it is not something that affects them deeply because it's just something that happens. A significant proportion of pregnancies end in miscarriages. That's why you try again. So when a lot of the emotional crux of the movie is centered around his grief about this incredibly common experience, I just can't help but think, this guy really does not have much to his life that actually warrants telling a story about, huh? At one point, there's a scene of him hanging out with his son, and they're having a good time, and I thought, oh, that's sad. He's fantasizing about the son he never had. But no, like I say, it turns out he actually does have a son. So presumably, that's who he was hanging out with. And again, I ask, what's so wrong with his current kids that he's so distraught about this one miscarriage decades ago? Oh wait, I just remembered one thing I haven't mentioned yet. There's this whole line about like Amazon buying Baja California, and the main character is told he has a meeting with the president. He's a journalist filmmaker rather than a fictional one, by the way. But yeah, this was very early on, so I was thinking, ooh, this will be an interesting movie. It's maybe going to be some sort of satire about like rich corporations having lots of power, and there'll be a political drama and intrigue, and it'll be exciting. Literally nothing happens. It goes totally nowhere. So yeah, overall I did find this film kind of boring. Also, there was a period of time where they were talking in English, but then as soon as I went to get some food, they started to speak in Spanish really quickly. So I was forced to pick between blindly stabbing at my food or every single time I glanced down for a second, missing several lines of dialogue. But honestly, I don't think there was much to this dialogue that was really an issue to have missed. And also, speaking of distraction, in the middle of this film, I did decide to check the reviews. I don't usually check reviews before going into a film, but if I'm not enjoying it, I like to see, because if everyone else is really liking it, then that might motivate me to look for something deeper, especially if the reviews mention something in particular. The main positive people mentioned was the cinematography, and yes, this movie did indeed look very nice. However, actually, this film has quite polarizing reviews of only 60% on Rotten Tomatoes. That's pretty damn low. It seems like a lot of people didn't like this. The film ends with him having a stroke and dying, which, I mean, fine, whatever. Yeah, to me, the biggest issue with this film is that it seems to be thematically about art and Mexican history relative to the United States, but Iñárritu hasn't really made any films about that topic, so it rings hollow as some sort of meta-commentary. And then the second issue is that there's supposed to be some family drama, but it's all pretty substanceless, and a big tragedy they're supposed to be getting over is actually a very common experience, which, yes, would be sad in the moment, maybe for months or years afterwards. But if the emotional catharsis of your life is finally getting closure about your stillborn baby, I feel like you've lived a pretty emotionally sheltered life. Sorry, that's just how it is. With that said, I don't know. I mean, I think my whole length thing has to come into play here. When I don't get much out of a movie and it's 2 hours and 20 minutes long, that just makes me less interested in watching it again and further regret the time I did spend watching it. So I guess what, like a middling 4? It at least had some interesting moments that kept me captivated, and it actually didn't feel its length, believe it or not, but I still wouldn't at all recommend it, so I can't give it a positive rating.
Right, next I watched Mrs. Paris Goes to Harris. That's not what it's called. Right, next I watched Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris, and I anticipated this would be a welcome break because after so many fancy artistic films, I suspected this one would be a much less demanding standard narrative. Indeed, this film ends up being very Brexit, which I approve of. It's about this working class Cockney woman who goes to France, where she finds that everyone is endeared by her uncouth British demeanour. Because if there's one thing the French are known for, it's loving the British and not being at all snooty. To be fair, there are some more snooty characters here, but they're the villainous exceptions, and they're both British and French. This was set in the 50s, so it was back when the only racial diversity were Jamaicans who came over after the war, and they still have the accent. And that's the kind of diversity Brexit geezers like, because most of those OG immigrants ended up voting Brexit themselves. This film is a good cautionary tale about why the working class deserve to be poor, because basically it's about this woman who is struggling to make ends meet, but she's still a habitual gambler, so she ends up winning by betting on football, and she sets her sights on buying a £500 dress from Dior in Paris. Now, I did some boning up, and £500 in 1957 is more like £15,000 today. But even that's not fully stating the case, because one of the biggest expenditures for people would be house prices. Well, in 1957, the average house price was about £2,000, so this dress cost 1/4 of the price of a house. Right now, the average house price is more like £200,000. I mean, we'll just ignore the fact she lives in London, where it would be more like 2 million. But yeah, just taking the conservative £200,000 estimate, which is interestingly about how much my house cost, that would mean this dress, in being a quarter of that price, would be equivalent to £50,000. So I guess this film is a little bit like that To Leslie film about the woman who won the lottery and then threw away all the money. This woman likewise wins a lot of money and immediately decides to squander it on a performative symbol of wealth and status, rather than building up any long-term wealth herself. Like I say, the poor deserve to stay poor. Especially since her winnings from gambling don't even amount to £500. She literally has to withdraw all her savings, and then she decides to bet all of that down at the dog racing track, and loses. Wow, easy come, easy go, I guess. But then she finds out that she should have been receiving a war widow's pension from the government. So she gets a load of back pay, and the bookie who took her money decides to hold on to £10, bet it again on her behalf, and is able to reimburse her more than her original stake. So yeah, obviously I'm being sarcastic when I say the poor deserve to stay poor. Although I do think poor people mismanage their finances when they come into a bit of money, and as such staying poor is a real phenomenon evidenced by lottery winners who throw it all away. But the more ridiculous thing here is just how fortunate it is that things work out for her, except for that one setback that ultimately doesn't amount to much. But yeah, it makes it kind of hard to take the film seriously when it's literally promoting gambling as a good method to ultimately achieve all your dreams. So with that said, she goes to Paris and they have a joke about the binman being on strike, that's funny, but the main thing that's crazy here is that, okay, obviously she's already been incredibly fortunate that 3 massive things happen to substantially increase her income. The average person doesn't win huge amounts from gambling, doesn't receive their stake back when they bet a huge amount and lose, and doesn't randomly receive news that the government owes them a huge amount of back pay. But then things get more ridiculous, because while initially there's this snooty woman who dismisses her as not being a worthy customer, almost every single other major person at this organization is instantly endeared to and fawns over her. First of all, this one guy I'll call Old Frenchie, and he is the first to be charmed by her, and it's like, oh, I'll escort you to view Dior's entire collection. And then when she decides she wants to buy something, she finds out that each dress is tailored to each specific person and will take a while to complete, and reveals she has no real ability to stay in Paris for several days because she just spent all her money on a dress. You'd think at this point they'd be like, this woman should not be buying a Dior dress. She's insane, and our next dress won't be seen on the catwalk, but in the gutter draped around this presumably soon-to-be homeless woman who must have gone into debt just to be here. Whether out of a desire to preserve their brand image or just out of concern for her financial well-being and mental health, they should have refused to take her money. But instead, they literally go out of their way to keep her around, with another guy I'm going to call Young Frenchie, revealing that his sister is out of town, so Mrs. Harris can stay at her apartment free of charge, of course. She also somewhat randomly makes friends with this girl I'm going to call Frenchie Girl, who it turns out is this really glamorous model who dates movie stars. So like at one point, she's walking down the catwalk with this really famous movie star, and Mrs. Harris waves at her, and she stops everything to go talk to Mrs. Harris because everybody just loves her. Oh, by the way, Young Frenchie loves Frenchie Girl, but like there's not really much of that as a character thing, it's just there in the background. It's ridiculous. There's no reason for all these very successful people high up in the fashion world to all be willing to just put aside so much to accommodate and befriend this random British woman. There's so many moments where she's speaking in a distinct Cockney accent, even using British slang and making all sorts of jokes, and somehow all of these French people are just totally able to not only understand English, but specifically her Cockney accent, and even pick up and fully connect with British humour. The big second act moment is after going out on the town socialising, she oversleeps and misses the fitting for the dress, but somehow she's able to just charm everyone into being like, well, I guess we could accommodate you somehow. The other big second act moment though is that she spends a lot of time hanging out with Old Frenchie, and you assume they're going to end up dating. But then he says that he likes her because she reminds him of his old cleaner when he was growing up, which is not a very romantic thing to say, so she is upset and walks off while he is left confused. I was expecting him to realise his mistake and show up in the third act to make a romantic confession of love, but no, he doesn't show up at all after this point, which makes this whole romance pretty pointless. Instead, she ends up being in a romantic relationship with this Irish guy, who, in not having gone to Paris, is absent for most of the movie, so it doesn't really make much sense. Anyway, so then this woman manages to insert herself into a workers' strike at Dior, and then she inspires Christian Dior himself to be like, We need to make more dresses that are more accessible to the common woman, like Mrs. Harris here. It's young Frenchie's idea, actually, but she is the one who tells him to tell Christian Dior, and it seems like even Christian Dior himself is enchanted by this random woman, and yet she is the explicit reference for why Dior needs to make stuff accessible to the average person. I do wonder whether Christian Dior actually funded this movie in some way, because obviously it does function very much as advertising for their brand. Okay, I looked into it, and yes, this was sponsored by Dior, of course. I say this because once she gets home, this friend of hers ends up setting the dress on fire. It's another poor people deserve to be poor thing. She has this girl she knows who's a working class aspiring actress, and she's given the Dior dress, but she sets it on fire and shows no sense of accountability for having destroyed something so priceless. You know, that's just what the poors are like. They have no regard for the value of anything, nor any willingness to own the substance of their mistakes. And of course, the House of Dior is just so nice and so kind that when they find out the dress was destroyed, they send her a new dress completely free of charge. So yeah, the gigantic problem with this film is how totally unrealistic all these good things that happen for Mrs. Harris are. If you were to list them all, it would take a while, but the two big ones would be how fortunate she is at the start with coming into all this money for no reason, and then everything about how much everyone at Dior just inexplicably loves her so much they treat her like she is the most supreme VIP. There's actually a moment where someone says the more high profile the client, the more they have to be accommodated, and she says that without a hint of irony, while they have one of their top models chaperoning this random woman who barely even has enough money to buy just one dress. And the issue is, when the film is so unrealistic, it makes it hard for me to get emotionally invested. That's what I wanted here. Just a dumb, feel-good movie. But there's a point at which it gets so dumb that you can't feel good because you're just confused. I did find myself smiling a bit at the end when she shows up to a party in her new dress, but deep down I was thinking, I just don't buy it. This whole thing feels stupid. Overall, I don't know, middling 3. It's a pretty bad movie. Right, so next, Babylon, a film for which my opinions exist in 3 distinct dimensions, one for each hour of the movie. See, at first, I thought this movie was going to be overwhelmingly about the excesses of the 1920s. You know, all the degeneracy of Hollywood with the drugs and the drinking and the nudity. Basically, this film would be a lot like The Wolf of Wall Street in terms of really leaning into the excess, and yeah, at first, it most definitely does. Like, the first half an hour or so is this really protracted party that feels like something out of Eyes Wide Shut. People are having sex right in the middle of the dance floor, some guy is getting pissed on, they're transporting an elephant at the start of the film, I guess just because having a menagerie of exotic animals is a way of showing off your status. It certainly was in ancient cultures. Right at the start, the elephant shits all over this one guy, and like, my film brain was thinking, does this in some way represent the Republicans? Because the Republicans were in charge for the entire 1920s. Anyway, with all this said, I was thinking the film is called Babylon because in biblical thought, Babylon is associated with the worst kind of pagan, godless degeneracy. And that seems to be the vibe they're going for here. Even the filmmaking itself is all about excess. The first film set they arrive at is this giant battle scene where some random extra gets drunk and impales himself on a real-life spear. There's no concern for health and safety. The battle gets so intense, they end up destroying all of the cameras they have on set, and this guy, Manny, has to drive out and buy some more, which they appreciate and let him into the filmmaking business based on. There's also a lot of sex stuff in the movie. Like, there's this whole scene of this one girl, Nellie, played by Margot Robbie, who's acting like, as they say, a total thought. This was a bit weird because I've seen movies from the 1920s, and will be watching even more of them in my next video, and I don't remember them being particularly sexual. I mean, they were kind of hinting at sexuality, but in a very non-overtly sexual way. I feel like it wasn't until very late into movie making that anyone even acknowledged sex was even a thing that existed. Except for the song My Girl's Pussy, which they sing in this and did actually exist back then, and that song is very sexual, but even then, like, they're at least going to the effort of providing plausible deniability that he's talking about a cat. There is this one line where a title card flashes up saying, "Spank me," but from what I've seen of older movies, typically guys spank girls, not in a sexual way, it's just how they say hello. So yeah, I was sort of like, alright, this is about the excesses and degeneracy of 1920s Hollywood. I don't know if it's really portraying accurately, but at least that's what this movie is about. The one thing I also enjoyed was the focus on the professionalism, that even with all this crap going on, they still lock in when it's time to actually perform to camera. Brad Pitt's character, Jack, is so drunk he can barely stand, but the second they start rolling, he's just immediately in character. Good stuff. But okay, here's the thing, right? After this, we then get people mentioning the arrival of talkies,
and this is treated as a seismic shift in the industry and in the culture. There's this really fun scene where they just focus on all the new considerations now they have to shoot for talkies, like people have to wear rubber soles on their feet. There's all sorts of technical issues that lead to them repeatedly having to cut and retake the shot, which gets increasingly funny as they get more frustrated. Oh, also the camera operator just straight up dies because he's trapped in the soundproof booth with the incredibly hot camera. So there is still this sense of things being intense like there was earlier. Jack gets shot by one of his ex-wives. But you definitely get the impression that this film is starting to be a little bit more about the transition from one era of film to another, rather than just focusing on the 1920s specifically. I also thought maybe this film would just be about the technical side of filmmaking at this point. Like, I enjoy how this explains why early actors spoke in this very demure manner, where they didn't emote too much. Because apparently early microphones weren't good with dramatic changes in pitch. Anyway, the problem is that Nellie goes from a star who's really charismatic and famous for her facial expressions and physical acting to no longer being taken seriously now she has to talk, although it's not clear what the issue is with her voice. There's this sense that like everyone's getting frustrated and things are falling apart for everyone. Nellie goes full on crazy and has a proper mental breakdown twice. First, she tries to fight a snake, gets bitten, and then makes out with the woman who saves her life by sucking out the venom. And then later on, when she tries to hang out with a bunch of upper-class people, she becomes conscious of how much she doesn't fit in, and berates them all, trashes the house, and throws up on the host. Not too dignified. Jack finds out that when he goes to see his first talkie performance, the audience ends up laughing at his scenes, even though they're supposed to be serious. This secondary character, Black Guy, who was doing quite well, now finds out that he's expected to black up, which he objects to morally, and the woman who Nellie made out with gets fired because turns out being a lesbian was not considered okay in the 1920s. Although I say the 1920s, it moves to the 1930s, which I guess is supposed to mark a period of transition. Jack does just shoot himself, so that fits with the idea that this is about that era of movies ending and the world leaving these guys behind. But this is where we enter into like the third part of the movie, which is pretty different in that it sort of returns back to the first part. See, Nellie gets really into debt from gambling, so Manny goes to see the guy she owes money to, and he brings money with him, brought by the love interest from the Amy Schumer romantic comedy I Feel Pretty. The problem is that that guy is the prop guy, so he brought prop money to meet with this gangster played by Tobey Maguire. But yeah, the reason I find this weird is that they end up going to another degenerate party with him with like all the same sex stuff, the same drugs and drink and all that. So I am sort of left wondering, what's the point? Is this about the 20s ending or not? Because it sort of undercuts that if you then show this same exact vibe still going on. Maybe the point is just how these guys are on the outside looking in. And to be fair to the 1920s, this party they go to is definitely a lot more perverse and dark in tone, with it featuring actively macabre acts. Anyway, so the gangsters realize they gave him fake money. So then there's a pretty bloody fight as they escape, and the prop guy ends up being shot later, but Manny is allowed to live. Oh, I should have mentioned that alongside Jack taking his own life, Nellie also dies at a young age, and this happens off-screen with it being reported on in a small tucked-away article in a newspaper to show her fall from fame. So there is still that sense that this film is about the passing of an era. I guess that is the overall point. But it's just interesting that at the end it turns much more into this overtly violent gangster movie, rather than early on, where it's very much centered on the drama within the filmmaking process itself. So yeah, to me it just seems like this film sort of lacks focus in that it departs from being about movies towards the end, but then weirdly ends up concluding with Manny reflecting on movies, and it shows flashes of movies throughout history, culminating in James Cameron's Avatar of all movies. You know, the movie that is mocked for having such a small amount of impact on culture. But yeah, whatever, the thing with this film is there's a lot going on, and a lot of it is entertaining, but this movie feels very grand and spectacular, so my instinct is to look for a clear message, and beyond just a generic, yep, things can change as time goes on, I couldn't identify much, unfortunately. With that said, despite this film's length, I would be interested in watching it again, and my opinion on it might improve, but I actually still found this film entertaining enough, so I'm inclined to give it a low 7. At least it was interesting and had a lot of spectacle, even if some aspects of that spectacle didn't completely make sense to me historically, narratively, or even thematically. So next, in anticipation of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, I watched Puss in Boots. Although at first I thought I'd made a mistake here, because while I will watch previous films in the franchise to give me some context for what I'm reviewing, there's only a point reviewing it if it was previously nominated for an Oscar. And I thought to myself, there's no way this film was nominated for Best Animated Picture, because my memory of it is that it isn't very good. Well, it turns out it's better than I remembered, but I'm still going to start with my criticisms, of which there are multiple. Firstly, the film isn't very funny. I was stone-faced the entire time, and the only jokes I found remotely funny was when Humpty Dumpty said the treatment of eggs in prison ain't over easy, Also, when Humpty Dumpty just says one word to the beanstalk and it immediately shoots up was funny in context. I mean, speaking of context, if you haven't seen this film, this probably sounds very weird. Anyway, those were the only 2 jokes that remotely qualified as jokes in my view, and they weren't that funny at all. Considering how Shrek is very much a comedy that actually makes even adults laugh regularly, this film feels like a bit of a letdown. Also, since this film was nominated for Best Animated Picture, I should say there's nothing remotely special about the animation. It's just, what the animation had to be to tell the story and remain aesthetically consistent with Puss in Boots' character. There's no animation that's particularly interesting. They weirdly don't do the whole cute eyes thing very often, but maybe I should admire the restraint there. They do, however, show Puss in Boots as a kitten, which is cute, and the goose that lays golden eggs is a gosling, so that's also cute. Well done. And I think my final criticisms, to address the elephant in the room of all the weird things I'm referring to, is I don't actually love this film's utilization of fairy tale characters. Basically, it's Puss in Boots, so it has that Zorro-adjacent Mexican-Western vibe, Westican as they say, so it's set in the desert, there's this old small town called San something, there's guns-slinging outlaws, and yeah, all that Western stuff. But then, the actual plot is that Jack and Jill are fearsome outlaws who have some magic beans that can be used to reach the golden goose, but the person who's really been obsessed with the golden goose is Humpty Dumpty. So you might be thinking, didn't Shrek typically utilize these fairy tale ideas in ways that actually made sense with the established significance of these characters? Like, the fairy godmother is actually doing fairy godmother things, just in an evil way because of for whom specifically she is a fairy godmother. Rumpelstiltskin is actually being a mischievous trickster. There is, on the other hand, no reason why it makes sense for Jack and Jill to be outlaws in this Western setting. The only Jack and Jilly thing about them at all is that Jack has apparently been crazy ever since he hurt his head tumbling down that hill. But yeah, as for being outlaws, I feel like in the story they're portrayed as more like helpful buffoons. They're fetching a pail of water and then they fall down a hill. And yet here, they're in a location where there are in fact no hills and no water. And then there's Humpty Dumpty. This is slightly better because firstly, he's the brains of the operation, so he's like an egghead. Also, he gets captured by soldiers on a bridge, and later on he does fall off that bridge and die. And also it makes sense that he, as an egg, would be obsessed with the golden goose. The only weird thing is they don't really bring together the most famous thing about him, which is that he fell and had to be put together again by the king's soldiers. I feel like they could have made him more intimidating as a villain if he was like stitched together and was clearly scarred from having fallen in the past, but instead, he's pristine. So yeah, those are my criticisms. Not funny, not creatively animated, and a lot of the fairy tale stuff here feels like scraping the barrel rather than including anything specific that makes sense. With all that said though, I still have a massive compliment for this film. I think character-wise, Humpty Dumpty is really interesting as a villain, because Puss in Boots and Humpty Dumpty are good friends because when Humpty Dumpty gets bullied, Puss stands up for him, and that's a good basis for them to like each other. But the interesting thing is, when they start being partners in crime, Puss gets increasingly uncomfortable with stealing from their own community, because he likes their community, but meanwhile Humpty doesn't, because he was bullied and an outcast. I respect the fact the villain's motivation really is just that he is mad and has ill will towards those around him, and he resents the fact that Puss is actually a nice guy who ultimately will always help the poor people of the town, so based on that everyone likes him. And yeah, the big betrayal is that Humpty tricks Puss into helping rob the town's bank, but then he gets caught after Puss abandons him, feeling his trust betrayed by having been duped into a heist that has left him a social pariah. I always like when media just leans into a villain being a villain ultimately because he's a villain, and this is a really simple but powerful way of showing a rift in a friendship. One is an outlaw with a heart of gold, while the other is an outlaw filled only with resentment. So with that said, yeah, he betrays Puss in the end. Sorry, I'm jumping over a lot here. Essentially, they steal the beans from Jack and Jill, Humpty saves Puss's life, but it makes sense as self-serving because Puss has the beans, and then when they go up the beanstalk, turns out the giant's already dead, so they don't need to worry about that, and retrieving the goose is all quite easy. But yeah, then you find out not only has Humpty betrayed Puss, but he's actually working with Jack and Jill. Now, this is where it gets a bit stupid, because why did he need Puss at all then? Like, I thought he needed Puss to help steal the magic beans, but if he's working with Jack and Jill, he could have just asked for them. And sure, maybe he needed Puss to help with the theft, but he actually already has a female cat burglar working with him because, love interest of Puss. So why does he need two? Is it just for the fun of betraying him, even though it would have been much easier to just ask Jack and Jill for the beans and then go together? In fact, when Puss tries to steal from Jack and Jill, they're really trying to get the beans off him. and the fight they have over them almost causes the beans to be lost entirely. The whole effort to steal the beans from them really makes no sense when viewed in hindsight. Like, Puss accidentally steps on a pig's tail, which alerts Jack and Jill to his presence, but if Jack and Jill are working with Humpty Dumpty and want the beans to be stolen, wouldn't they just pretend they didn't hear anything and let them escape? Whatever, yeah, that's pretty dumb. But Humpty's plan is pretty good because it involves Puss being arrested, and then it turns out because they stole the baby goose, the mama goose is going to come looking and destroy the whole town. But then the female cat decides to help Puss in Boots escape because, love interest, and he convinces Humpty to become a good guy. I don't find this that unrealistic because Humpty's anger was based on feeling hated and like he could never be good, so it makes sense that Puss inviting him to be a hero could be all he needed. So with that said, they fight to save the town, with Jack and Jill becoming the final main villains because they want to keep the golden goose for themselves. In the end, Humpty makes a pretty heroic sacrifice to save the town because in a parallel of the earlier scene, they're on the bridge where Puss abandoned Humpty, but this time he refuses to do so. So Humpty makes it easier for Puss to choose to save the town over saving him by letting go and falling and dying. He cracks and it turns out on the inside he's a golden egg because deep down he was always a good guy. Wow, what a beautiful story. Oh, I forgot to mention, by the way, he gets his iconic boots as a really random gift for helping this one lady not get trampled by a raging bull. Like, okay, fair enough. But it just felt so random as a reason for him to get his boots that why even bother including an explanation at all? Anyway, overall, I did like the character of Humpty Dumpty and the relationship with Puss in Boots. I mean, it wasn't high art or anything, but for a kid's film, it's pretty deep, and it's crazy that Humpty just straight up dies in the end. However, there is a lot of the rest of the film that is bad. I'm actually still probably only going to give it a high 5. It's better than average, but there are much better films than this. I've given a 6. So I don't think it deserves that.
Right, so next I watched Puss in Boots, The Last Wish, obviously, and I guess it would be good to just address my criticisms of the previous film, whether they carry through here. First, I will say this film isn't that much funnier, but it is marginally so. It has a lot more actually comedic characters, like this one who I'm confident enough is played by John Mulaney that I'm not actually going to look it up. There's also a whole group of people who sound like Brexit geezers, which I always find funny. They're like, all I smell is cat pee. What a silly accent. The animation is more interesting, very different from the first film, but part of that is just that they massively increase the saturation and also have them in this fantastical magical environment where there are a lot more colours in general. Also, the animation itself and the fight scenes kind of felt derivative of Into the Spider-Verse, but overall I'd still say this animation was good enough that I can't complain about it being boring or anything like that. And then of course the third criticism I had was that the fairy tale elements weren't incorporated that well into the story in a way that makes sense. Well, I could talk about that, but first of all I'm going to have to acknowledge what will become apparent in me talking about that. This movie has like an insane number of characters. Arguably too many. So you know what, I'm just going to list them off. First of all, we have Puss in Boots, and also the love interest in the first film is back. He also has a dog sidekick called Perito. It seems like he's being hunted by Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but actually by the end of the film they end up more as allies than antagonists. However, another person trying to gain access to the wish, which is the central treasure of the movie, is Jack Horner. And he has several sidekicks, including Jiminy Cricket, who is rather comedically played by a Jimmy Stewart impersonator, and tries fruitlessly to be Jack Horner's conscience. That's funny. But then, at the same time as this, you also have the fact that Puss in Boots is down to his last 9 lives, and as such, he is being pursued by Death himself. So basically you have the central team, then another rival non-villainous team, then an outright antagonist, and then another antagonist on top of that. It honestly is ridiculous just how many characters there are here, and it sort of leaves me thinking, yeah, this film is entertaining, but maybe more because of quantity than quality. Still, I do think the whole fairy tale thing is better handled, although in the case of the ultimate antagonist Death, and the ultimate point of the plot, the ability to have any wish you want, neither of those seem to be explicitly related to any fairy tale. Unless I blinked and missed it, I don't remember any explanation for where this wish came from. But yeah, Jack Horner obviously is not really much of a character, but to be fair, they kind of lean into that. The joke here is that he was a side character in the story who is resentful that he didn't get a full fairy tale to himself. He does operate a pie factory, but yeah, the main thing is he wants to be a sorcerer so people respect him, rather than some kid who just stuck his thumb in a pie. I also like how he's characterized as a nepo baby who just inherited his pie enterprise, adds something to him as a villain that he feels entitled to be great. Goldilocks and the Three Bears work. She keeps referring to things needing to be just right. Also, the fact she was abandoned by her parents, although isn't that Hansel and Gretel? Whatever. The fact she was abandoned by her parents means her wish is to have a family, but in the meantime she has her bear sidekicks. And honestly, bears are a pretty intimidating group of henchmen, so I quite like the way these characters work together. I do also enjoy the world building of the magical area they enter. One cool thing is that the landscape changes to be less hostile if someone who doesn't want the wish has the map. So yeah, Perito is a chihuahua who doesn't really want anything. So he is able to just guide Puss and the female cat Softpaws through without too much issue, at least until the other guys catch up with them. Oh, I should mention that there is a drama between Softpaws and Puss in Boots because he abandoned her at the altar. At first you think it's going to be that he betrayed her during a heist or something, so it's kind of treated like a twist when you find out actually it was because he was supposed to marry her. But here's the problem, right? By the time you get to the end, it turns out nobody really has a reason to need the wish, because Chihuahua guy didn't need it at all, and the only thing that Softpaws wanted was somebody she could trust, but she ends up finding out that actually Puss is willing to commit to her and is more trustworthy than she realized, so it turns out she doesn't need that wish. And Goldilocks wants to wish for a family, but pretty obviously she realizes at the end that the bears are the only family she ever needed. You'd think that Puss might need it because he's being pursued by Death, but then when he actually fights Death, he shows a willingness to fight for his one life, and the only reason Death was pursuing him is he was mad that Puss wasn't taking his life seriously as much, and as such basically mocking Death. So now that he's seen Puss actually fighting for his one remaining life and taking it seriously, he has no reason to try to take it. But this only works because Puss accepts the value of just having one life to live, so again, by the end of this, he doesn't really need the wish. So the only guy left is Jack Horner, who does want to make a wish, but for evil reasons, so they defeat him, which is good, but they defeat him by destroying the scroll that grants the wish, which seems like a bit of a waste. Anyway, so I think I might be getting tendinitis in my left arm from all the typing I've been doing, which is incredibly unfortunate, and I just hope that by not touching it, it will heal. But in the meantime, I feel like I should just list off all the other things I've written down as notes, and not really, put any effort into the prose. It's crazy how many times I forgot that Death even existed. Like, you'd be going through scenes where all of the other villains and all of the other characters were doing things, and they just randomly be like, oh yeah, that guy. Jack Horner has a load of different magical instruments, and I basically liked all of them. There's a bit where he promises someone their weight in gold, and then he hands them King Midas's hand, and it turns them into gold. So literally, their weight in gold. He also has a load of Cinderella's stuff which he uses. So his transport is a pumpkin that he smashes in case of emergency, and it turns into a carriage. He also wields Excalibur, but he wasn't actually able to pull the sword from the stone, so he just uses it as a mace, like with the stone attached to the sword. I like that one of the challenges in the nice version of the world is a pocket full of posies, and the way you get through it is just by stopping and smelling them and appreciating them. But for all of the bad guys, they just view it as a threat to be solved with violence, and then one of the flowers straight up turns carnivorous and eats a guy, and you see a skeleton and everything. Oh, also, they do the whole Puss in Boots is cute thing, but he gets into a competition with softballs to see who can be the most cute, so obviously that's very cute. Anyway, the movie ends with a teaser for Shrek 5 as they sail off to far, far away, which is fun. Can't wait. I forgot to write down or record a score. High 6. Right, so next with my tendons partially healed, I watched Blonde, the Marilyn Monroe biopic. Now, I have a confession. I have never actually seen a single movie starring Marilyn Monroe. I'd like to. I like older classic movies, but I've just never gotten around to it. With that said, I don't really know much about Marilyn Monroe in general, but this film didn't make much sense to me in the way it portrayed her. Specifically, it didn't present her as being at all charismatic or charming, and instead, she just seemed utterly miserable for the entire thing. Like, she would literally be on the red carpet and just look like a deer in the headlights with no idea what she was doing or why she was there. She didn't seem like a commanding presence at all. She also didn't seem very charming in her personal life, which that seems more like it could actually be true, but it does beg the question of why exactly she appealed to so many men. I mean, there's a scene towards the end where we see her banging Kennedy, and he literally just treats her as entirely disposable, whereas I feel like the popular imagination is that there was a lot more mutual enthusiasm. She's literally just delivered to his bedroom by the Secret Service, blows him while he's on the phone talking about business, he berates her and then has her escorted out. Meanwhile, Monroe is just having this internal monologue about how self-loathing and worthless she feels. I'm not sure, it seemed a bit much. So I remembered hearing this film was poorly reviewed, and I decided let me look up why this film was so badly reviewed, and it turns out it was for exactly the reasons I've laid out here. Overwhelmingly, people dislike this movie because it portrays Monroe as just very pathetic. But I will admit, while I picked up on that as something that seemed off to me, I wasn't going to massively mark down the film for it. Like, this film is very badly reviewed, seemingly largely based on this misrepresentation of her character. Now, admittedly, like I say, I don't really know much about Marilyn Monroe. I was just going off a vibe that it doesn't seem like she actually behaved the way this film presents her. But it is possible that for people who know more about her, it's even more obvious obvious and thus more egregious that this film is so inaccurate. See, in a way, I kind of liked the fact that this film, in being so melancholic and introspective, sort of avoids actually feeling like a biopic. Like, Marilyn is so in her own head at times that it doesn't feel like the film is just telling us the events of her life, which is an annoying thing biopics usually do. Instead, this movie would be almost unchanged if it was about a completely random depressed woman instead of Marilyn Monroe. And in some sense, yeah, that's bad, but at least it made it feel more like a movie than, remember famous person? Here's all the things they did. The only fan servicey moment was that picture of her skirt flying up in the breeze, but even that is presented as immediately leading to her being physically abused and divorced by Joe DiMaggio, who is jealous of the fact everyone is ogling her. So yeah, actually, all the moping had me more interested in the actual character, accurate or not, of this woman, in a way that I wouldn't have been if it was just some film with a narrator like, I'm Marilyn Monroe, and here's me the first time I auditioned for a movie role, and then we just follow her through her life like we're watching a documentary. Still, by the 2-hour mark, I was getting a little bored, and this film is over 2 hours and 40 minutes. So it's never good when I get to the end of a film, and I just want it to be over, even if I was enjoying it for the first 2 hours. Something else strange about this film is that it's sort of weirdly conservative, not in a bad way, but just in an unexpected way for a movie about someone like her. Her having an abortion is portrayed as a tragedy that she was forced into by controlling doctors, which, okay, maybe that's the case, but the other weird thing is that all of her behavior is presented as extending from the fact she didn't have a father, like that having a strong male influence as a child would have straightened her out. She keeps calling other men daddy and seeing her father everywhere. In fact, the last shot of the movie when she overdoses and goes to heaven, it's a vision of her father. It's not exactly that I disagree. I'm sure that all kids benefit from having both parents, but there are a lot of single mothers out there. So it's interesting this movie in particular is the one that decides to lean into her not having a dad as the whole basis for all her problems. I mean, the real whole basis for all her problems, I guess, would be that her mum is crazy. Weirdly, just like in The Fabelmans, this movie has a scene of the mum driving her children directly towards a natural disaster. In that movie, it was a tornado. Here, it's a California wildfire. Her mother is totally crazy, and I was getting sad thinking about how so many kids are just raised by mentally unstable parents who abuse them, and really those parents shouldn't have kids. The good news is that she gets taken to a foster home, and it turns out that in real life she was actually given up to a foster home as a baby. So that is an inaccuracy. One thing which, God knows if this is an inaccuracy, but she's in an MMF polyamorous relationship with 2 dudes, one of whom is the son of Charlie Chaplin. Yeah, so the guys seem to be gay for each other, but then they also fuck Marilyn. However, it then seems like they're just scum because they later blackmail her with some naked photos they took. So I am sort of left wondering what the point of these characters even was. Again, if the film is conservative, then the message could be that gay couples are evil and will ruin your life. Is that the point? Artistically, the film isn't bad. It's in black and white for the most part, which makes sense with the time period. There is this one really cool shot where she is taking drugs on a plane, and she gets up and it somehow seamlessly in one shot transitions to her being in a crowded movie theater. Like the aeroplane aisles turn into cinema seats. Don't know how they pulled that off, but well done, proud of you. Anyway, that's actually the full extent of the notes I wrote down. This isn't much about this film, but in summary, it's an okay depiction of a woman who is suffering from mental health issues, and it's kind of entertaining just as a raw exploration of that. However, it's not a very compelling presentation of Monroe herself, seemingly not an accurate one, and fails to really cohere with the myth of her as this iconic sex symbol when she comes across as anything but. Having said that, I'm not inclined to review this movie as unfavourably as some, because honestly I do prefer this to a potentially more accurate, but less artistically creative, faithful retelling of the events of her life. I do need to actually get around to watching some movies actually starring her though, now that I've seen a movie about her. Either way, yeah, not terrible. High 6? I almost want to be super contrarian and rate this movie a lot of other people hate as a 7, but I suspect if I knew more about her I would be more annoyed by the inaccuracy, so I'll keep this stuck at a 6. Next, I watched RRR, or Rise, Roar, Revolt, known to most people as that random, insane Indian movie that suddenly made everyone pay attention to Indian cinema briefly. This might be a weird place to start, but since I'm British and this is about a rebellion against the British, I couldn't help but think of this movie in light of colonialism. Like, what are the politics? I say that. I concluded pretty quickly that for the most part it doesn't matter and I don't care, because I honestly do feel like India and the UK are pretty chill now. I've never met an Indian who seems to sincerely resent the British Empire. It's usually black people who hold on to the whole oppressive white colonizers thing. Also, interestingly, I went to an Indian grocery today, and I like to imagine that since I don't mind the cultural exchange in this direction, we don't have to get too upset even if the cultural exchange in the other direction was a little more enforced. But yeah, with that said, I guess my main concern would be that this movie was going to be really preachy, and yet in some sense it is, because you do have a lot of scenes of the British officers mistreating people. At one point, this random Brexit geezer calls the main character a wanker. But what struck me as shockingly nuanced is that the main character is a British loyalist. From now on, I'll just call him Loyalist Guy. He's in the British police force, and he's really cool even as he's arresting protesters against the British Empire at the start. In fact, being really cool might understate it. He jumps into a group of hundreds of people and is able to fight them all off as he drags one guy back to the British base to arrest him. Even still, they show the injustice that despite being so much better than his peers, the white soldiers are all elevated above him. Still, I was thinking this is interesting. Like, there's some nuance here that a heroic character is fighting for the British in this Indian film. There is also a British woman who opposes the mistreatment, but I think that's just so she can be set up as a love interest. Now, having said that, this film does get a lot more revolutionary towards the end, and it actually ends with a song with lyrics explicitly celebrating the legacy of the revolution and calling for Indians from all different backgrounds to come together in remembering the freedom that their forefathers fought for. So yeah, in some sense this movie is just a British bad movie, and in fact the Brits can be ridiculously over the top evil villains here. But I actually don't even know if this is entirely political, because in general, a lot of stuff is over the top in this movie. Like, yeah, the main British villain here, who I will call Villain Guy, is like comedically over the top in how evil he is. But at the same time, I get the impression Indian cinema usually isn't abounding in subtlety, so maybe this is just the way every villain acts. His wife is the funniest character. I literally laughed so hard where she's getting super excited about the fact that this one Indian rebel is going to be whipped for rebelling. And she's literally like, I bought my own whip. And it's just this whip with nails in it. She made it herself, I can only assume. She's just in it for the love of the game. I do wonder where they find these actors. They're not very good, which is sort of what I'd have expected. The main guy both looks and acts like the guy from that Walking Dead gay porn parody. But yeah, the point is that actually how evil they are is just so funny. At one point they just randomly shoot a child, although the particular focus of the main villain is pointing out that bullets are too expensive to waste on Indians. This sets up the only clever line in the movie where the main rebel guy points out that if bullets aren't worth using on Indians, then their only value must be being used against the British. Can't argue with that logic. Anyway, the main thing that solidifies the role of these guys as the villains in this story is that they buy this village girl, but the parents thought they were just giving her a tip for the performance she did. They didn't realize they were buying her. I like this miscommunication where either the villains thought that a small tip was enough money to buy a child, or the parents thought enough money to buy a child was a small tip. I imagine it's the former, since as we've established, these guys don't value Indians very highly. But with that said, it makes it funny when you see all this destruction, and I'm left thinking, so all of this has happened for the sake of rescuing a child who I can only assume they purchased for the equivalent of like £5. I imagine the British higher-ups would have been very angry to find out an entire empire-destroying rebellion emerged from a fight over a child purchased with pocket change. Anyway, with that said, on the subject of all this destruction, the action scenes here were just ridiculous. Everything was so over the top. Probably the main scene for this, and the one that had me laughing the most, was when the rebel guy shows up to a party, and he is driving a truck that just has loads of wild animals in cages. So when he arrives at the party, he does this sharp turn, and all these tigers and bears and wolves pour out and just start attacking all the soldiers. At one point, he just picks up a leopard and throws it at someone. Then Loyalist Guy comes in with a flaming chariot and launches it at Rebel Guy, and they have this insane over-the-top fight. With that said, at least this violence has consequences. There are some pretty gruesome deaths here, which I found awesome. Of all the movies I have reviewed here, I can say that this is the only one that at multiple points just had me laughing and shaking my head in disbelief at how crazy this is. But I say crazy, maybe I should say stupid, because strictly speaking, this movie isn't good. Us sophisticated Western audiences wouldn't tolerate half the nonsense that happens here as anything we'd consider in an actually good movie. I'm trying to imagine if Black Panther was like this. As much as people say that movie is overhyped, I think even its biggest enthusiasts would say it was stupid schlock if it had a scene where Black Panther literally picked up a Black Panther and threw it at someone. But yeah, the thing that stands out to me as making this movie worse is tone. This movie has a very weird tone.
Like, from what you've heard so far, I'm sure you're thinking, alright, cool, this is like a violent action movie, that makes sense. What if I told you in the middle it randomly becomes a chill rom-com? Basically, rebel guy has a crush on English girl, so loyalist guy decides to help him out. There's a lot of genuinely quite charming comedy, where because loyalist guy speaks English, he's sort of helping out rebel guy. You might be wondering if one is a loyalist and the other is a rebel, why are they friends? Well, at this point, they don't know about their rival allegiances. But yeah, so there's just a lot of like silly jokes here. The one that makes no logical sense is he asks her what her name is, and she says, "You don't have to call me madam, just Jenny." And he thinks that's her whole name. Funny joke, right? But for some reason, he translates the English words she says into Telugu, or whatever language he's speaking. But that only makes sense if he knows the meaning of the English words, whatever. Or maybe he wasn't translating them, because it didn't sound like he was saying, "You don't have to call me madam," but it also didn't sound like he was saying Jenny when he said that either. Accents really can make words hard to decipher. For all I know, this entire movie is in English just with a thick Indian accent. Anyway, yeah, then there's this ridiculous full-on Bollywood dance-off in the middle of this fancy English garden party. Yes, that does very much contradict the broader tone of the film. Indeed, this very garden, all of this is happening, is where later a tiger will crush a bunch of people's skulls in its jaws as the rebel guy goes from dance party to massacre. And the only relevance of all this to the plot is that in the most insane coincidence ever, this girl rebel guy has a crush on happens to be working for the family that bought the girl at the beginning, his sister. Small world. I mean, I know the Indian population has expanded rapidly, but I didn't realize a century ago it was like a few hundred people. Anyway, just some thoughts on the music. This film does have some real Bollywood moments. What I enjoy is that based on the subtitles, the lyrics were like really directly about what happens. Like there's this one central song that's literally just like, "Two friends should be enemies based on the differences between them. There are many things that are not known. Someday this will end in bloodshed. And then when that happens, there might be an end to this friendship. A friendship built on a foundation of untruthfulness." Yes, that is the story. Well done. Also, during that song, there is the most stupid moment where somehow a horse is able to keep pace with a motorbike. How? One compliment for the music, though, is that when Rebel Guy gets whipped, he sings this song, and it is actually very moving. Usually the music here feels like a departure from the tone, but here the lyrics in the tune perfectly complemented the fact this is a low point for the character. But don't worry, he's going to get rescued, because you know how I said the loyalist guy was a loyalist guy? He isn't, although I'm still going to call him that so you know who I'm talking about. See, at first, you think the point is they're friends with competing objectives, but they're friends. And like the whole tension is around whether they will realize the other's true nature. And honestly, I was kind of a bit disappointed because I thought that was a much more interesting foundation for a conflict in the movie. And yeah, when we find out actually the loyalist guy has this whole backstory where he only became an officer so he could gain access to guns to help the rebellion, it seems pretty stupid. I mean, it honestly is pretty stupid that the whole conflict between these two is based on a miscommunication. But at the same time, I was just thinking, about an hour and a half in, where can they go from here? The movie is 3 hours, so the fact that one guy reveals he has dual loyalty is exciting. So yeah, basically he realizes that he shouldn't sacrifice his friend just for his goal of getting guns to the rebels, so he decides to save his friend who's been sentenced to death. The escape is pretty cool. I mean, it's still kind of dumb, but I like the fact the loyalist guy, in being in charge of the guns, made it so the men had no bullets, so it's a pure hand-to-hand grudge match. But yeah, in the end the loyalist gets arrested, and Rebel never realizes that loyalist was actually on his side. But yeah, if you thought the coincidence earlier was insane, well, I might have to revise down how big the population of India must have been at the time, because he completely randomly happens to meet Loyalist Guy's wife, who then reveals the wider objective of the Loyalist, and Rebel Guy is like, "Oh no, I better save him then." One thing I really liked about this is I would say it doesn't really make much sense at all that this destruction is just because of this one little girl. So having this guy whose actual motivation is to take down the Empire itself adds a bit more weight to things. And Rebel Guy even acknowledges that he's kind of being selfish, and that he's just focusing on his own personal issue, while the guy who he thought was the Loyalist is actually the true revolutionary. But yeah, that coincidence, there's just no excusing it. Anyway, just one more ridiculous fight featuring the Rebel Guy tearing off the door to the jail with his bare hands and carrying Loyalist Guy on his shoulders because his legs are broken. This scene is just so stupid. Basically, the guy on his shoulders is shooting everyone while the other guy is running, and they're like doing flips and stuff while being one guy carrying another guy on his shoulders. The guy on the shoulders does like a full-on muscle up while carrying this whole other dude. And then this all just leads to the big climax. The entire barracks gets blown up, the villains both get killed. At one point, Rebel Guy picks up a motorbike and starts wielding it like a sword. Standard Indian movie stuff. Well done, cue the music. So yeah, my overall thoughts are that this movie is really thoroughly entertaining, but I don't think I can say in good conscience that it's good
because it isn't. There are some issues of tone, and even the thing that makes it entertaining, which is the ridiculous over-the-top action and some of the characterization, that stuff is in itself a problem, and would be a problem in a better movie. So I can only really regard this movie as being entertaining in that it's bad. Having said that, I don't necessarily think that's a huge problem. I think it's still okay for a movie to be entertaining in a way that's kind of stupid, and doesn't really speak to any real quality. I'm almost tempted to give this movie a 7 just because it entertained me, because the real problem is when movies are boring. However, I guess that's probably ridiculous, and I honestly think that people who are pretending this is actually a good movie and giving it ratings of like 8 or 9 out of 10, they're being insane. For me, this movie is at best a high 6. It doesn't get a high 6 for any real quality in it, but it is definitely entertaining. And to be honest, if every single movie this lacks in quality could be as entertaining as this, the world would be a better place. But yeah, the best I can give it is a high 6. It does feel a bit weird to be giving this the same rating as the movie Blonde, considering that they are very different movies, but yeah, sometimes you can go in multiple ways to get to the same direction, which is, I guess, what we saw with the two main characters in this film. Right, so the interesting thing about Top Gun Maverick is that it is the only movie from this Oscars that I have watched 3 times. But what's perhaps more interesting, certainly more complimentary, is that if there was one movie from all of these that I'd have to watch again, even within just a few weeks, I would choose this one. Don't get me wrong, there are some other movies on this list that I would be interested to watch again just to see what I really thought of them on a second watch. After Sun is the big one. But the thing is, I don't think I'd enjoy that movie as much as Top Gun Maverick, because even after 3 watches, I found this film to be thoroughly enjoyable. And even as I was watching it, I was thinking, man, I'd love to just be sat around with the family and see that this movie is on TV, and everyone could just sit there and watch it, and everyone would enjoy it. Honestly, I don't even know how much I have to say about this film, because I'm not sure I'm qualified to offer an analysis of it. Like, this film is just so perfectly constructed for maximized entertainment value that I feel like half of what made it so entertaining to me is stuff I couldn't even identify. All I know is in this world of limited attention spans and the desire to peer down at your phone to do something else, a desire I try to resist but I'm not immune to, I didn't even have to resist. I didn't have a single moment of being tempted to do something other than watch this film. I was locked in. So I guess I'll talk about some of what made this film so entertaining, starting with the title, Maverick. I think this film is genuinely the perfect lone maverick versus stuffy establishment movie of all time. Sorry, Robin Williams, turns out rebelling against orthodoxy is much cooler at Mach 10. From beginning to end, Maverick is just doing crazy things, pushing the limits, doing what everyone says can't be done. Every time the higher-ups say something is impossible, he proves it can be done. And then the establishment are the perfect contrast to this. They want to stop manned missions and move towards replacing pilots with robots, unmanned drones. There's this sense that this film is deeply human. It's about how humans can think and feel and intuit and have values and courage and honor, and that's what makes them indispensable in the cockpit. At the same time, the establishment also views humans as disposable. Their attitude is not entirely villainous. Basically, they just want to fly the central mission in a way where it's more likely to succeed, but it makes it much less likely all the pilots will return alive. Meanwhile, Maverick has a plan that's much more ambitious to pull off, but it means all the pilots will survive. And on that note, it's crazy how exciting the final mission is. Even though you can assume that nobody is going to die because the point of the story is that Maverick's methods mean everyone comes back safe, it's still really exciting just seeing how they pull it off. Speaking of, another reason this movie is great is the mission itself. Like, the film is actually incredibly simple. There's some uranium being enriched by some nondescript bad guys, and Maverick needs to train a new crop of fighters to destroy it. But because the film is about training for that one mission, it means that they spend the first hour and a half just explaining everything that makes the mission difficult, exactly what needs to be done to do it right, and showing you through their training how difficult this really is. The other thing they're doing here, of course, is building up characters. We get a really good idea of who exactly these people are. My favourite character is called Hangman, who's a bit of a dickhead, but in the end he comes through like a hero and is ultimately the one who saves the day. In some ways this movie is cliché, but I do appreciate that rather than going for the obvious guy who behaves like a dick is the bad guy route, they actually show that ultimately these guys all have each other's back. And then, of course, the other big character thing is that Maverick has tension
with Goose's son, Rooster, because Rooster, I guess, blames Maverick for Goose's death. This is, in some sense, one of the more stupid aspects of the movie because it's pretty irrational in the military where people die all the time to hold a grudge about something like that, but still it adds some emotional intensity, and also Maverick sabotaged Rooster's career because he didn't want Rooster risking his life like his dad did. Speaking of going back to the past, this movie has a lot of nostalgia stuff. There's too much to list, but yeah, obviously a lot of the classic songs from the past. Iceman is back and then dies in a really tragic scene. It must have been weird for Val Kilmer, suffering from throat cancer, to star in a movie where he dies from throat cancer shortly before he died from throat cancer in real life. Or maybe cathartic. It is actually quite a beautiful send-off. Oh wait, never mind, I just googled it and turns out he got healed from cancer, but I guess it had a serious impact on his overall health, so he died of general poor health later. Anyway, and they also have a hot, shirtless, oiled up sports playing scene. That's what Top Gun was really about. Oh, and how could I forget the biggest bit of nostalgia? At the end, Top Gun and Rooster get stuck behind enemy lines and they have to fly away using a relic from the past, the very same type of plane they would have flown back in the 80s. And obviously there's a broader point to the fact that this much older plane is able to hold its own against these technologically more advanced planes. Yeah, that's how you do nostalgia. Obviously, blah blah blah, the US military-industrial complex is evil, this movie was probably funded by the CIA, don't actually join the military, kids. But as an adult, I can just pretend, like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, this is taking place in a fictional world where the nominal good guys actually are good, and enjoy it based on that. Yeah, this movie is just really solid. In some ways, possibly the best written non-fantasy action-adventure film of all time. And I specify non-fantasy because this film couldn't just rely on having like monsters or superpowers or something like that. This film is simple and it is relatively grounded, if you'll pardon the expression, but it is nonetheless incredibly entertaining. Perhaps not in spite of that simplicity, but because the simplicity is the result of such a tightly constructed story. Genuinely, high 8. I keep thinking middling 8. It feels weird to rate this movie so high because in some ways it is just cliche, emotionally trite, military propaganda slop, but it is all of those things so well written that it is elevated to an art form. There are a few movies out there I feel like I could literally watch again and again and again and never get bored. All those movies are fantastic. The first 2 Harry Potters, the first 3 Jurassic Parks, all of the Lord of the Rings. They're not like your proper art house, deep, introspective, emotional movies that usually get super high ratings. They're much simpler movies, but they're just so good at what they're doing. And most of those movies get rated a 9 out of 10 by me. So yeah, this warrants at least a high 8. Well done. Right, so next I watched The Quiet Girl. More like The Irish Girl. This film is set in Ireland, and it's actually a foreign language film because they speak Irish in it. I've always thought that Britain should submit foreign language films based on the fact that we do have some native non-English languages here. So I endorse this move from Ireland, which I've always said is basically Britain as well. It was a little bit annoying that the subtitles didn't provide dialogue for when they would occasionally speak English in a thick Irish accent, so weirdly the Irish parts I could understand, but the English parts I couldn't as well. The thing about this film is that it is a little bit of a nothing happens movie. It's about a girl who is, I guess, just a little bit difficult for her parents who have multiple other kids. She keeps wetting the bed and skiving from school. You know, standard stuff that indicates a child is maybe struggling with some issues. So they send her away to some childless friends. I don't know what their relationship is. And to be honest, I first thought that where she was initially was actually an orphanage, and the point was that the couple had adopted her. But no, instead, where she initially was with her biological parents, but then I guess they needed a break from her, so they sent her away. But then weirdly, they take her back after her parents have had another child, which you'd think would just make things harder for them. It really isn't clear exactly why they send her away and why they bring her back. Either way, the main point is that in the meantime, she forms a growing attachment to these adoptive parents. It's all pretty subtle. An interesting point of contrast would be with this British movie called Good Night, Mr. Tom, about a boy who is sent away from London during the Blitz to live in a village. In that movie, his mother is actively abusive towards him, while the titular Mr. Tom rapidly warms up to him, and there are these big kind of cheesy emotional moments, but it's actually very cute. I endorse it if you haven't seen it. In the case of this film, the growing connection goes largely unsaid, as they have a few quiet moments of just talking and exposing their growing vulnerability. Significantly, the couple actually had a child of their own who died, so for them, having her around is especially nice. The mother immediately starts being really kind to her and doting on her. The dad is a pretty typical dad in that at first he's a bit distant, but then they have some deep conversations, and by the end of the film, he's actually the one who she tearfully hugs goodbye. But the honest truth is, there isn't actually much substance to this movie in terms of plot. Indeed, I spent most of it just trying to work out when it was set. At first, I thought it could be straight up Victorian because I was like, oh, it's an orphanage. And also at one point, the dad is talking about putting the girl to work and she's like 12. But then they have cars and TVs, so it must have been at least the 1950s. It feels like it must be quite old because she's impressed by them having a freezer and doesn't seem to know what it is. Like her adoptive mother has to literally be like, this keeps perishable items cold, so they last for longer. So alright, this is a time where people might not have been familiar with owning a freezer. I imagine that was a long time ago. The big issue is that I suspect rural Ireland is in a lot of ways quite far behind the veritable metropolis of southeast England where I live, so there were times where I was genuinely thinking, could this actually be the modern day? Like, while I'm sat here writing on my fancy new laptop, watching this movie with my 1 gigabyte per second internet speed, in Ireland, rural Ireland at least, there are kids going, what's this fancy new freezer thing you're talking about? Where's the salt cellar? Well, no, it's not modern because at one point they talk about something costing £1, so this would be prior to the adoption of the euro in the new millennium. As such, this could be set in the 90s, but it could honestly be in the 70s too. I don't think it's 60s because they briefly watch TV and it's in colour. But yeah, the thing is, that's most of what I was thinking about while watching this film because, for the most part, nothing really happens. The only remotely exciting moment is towards the end she falls in a well, which I thought would be this massive drama where they have to rescue her, maybe even resuscitate her. But even then there's not much drama. Instead, by the time they find out, she's already got out of the well herself and is walking back. So the stakes there are that she'll get a bit chilly. Oh dear. Now let me stress, I'm not saying this movie is boring. Something doesn't have to be boring just because nothing happens. As a chill, fly-on-the-wall experience, just watching people go about their lives, I found this perfectly engaging to watch. Having said that, I have very little more I could possibly force myself to say, and I don't have much interest in watching this movie ever again. I do think for this film to be better, it might have had to lean into the melodrama more and be a bit more cheesy. As it is, it's nice and charming in how understated it is. There's very little dialogue, as you'd expect from the title. But I didn't connect with this film very much emotionally because the emotions were all very small. And honestly, I don't really understand why she was staying with this couple in the first place and why her parents decided they wanted her back. So yeah, I guess it's sad that she can't stay with them longer, but I mean, she can still hang out with them a bit. It seems like they still live in the same basic community. It's not like they're miles away. Anyway, overall, high 6, it's good, it's entertaining, it's got an emotional through line that is compelling, but there's just not enough so that I would really want to watch this film again, nor would enthusiastically recommend it to anyone else. Right, so next I watched Triangle of Sadness, and here are my thoughts on that. A friend disliked this film, claiming that the themes are too obvious. So basically, the movie is about this yacht full of rich people, but then it crashes on a beach and all the rich people are totally incompetent, so this one member of staff who is actually competent ends up being in charge. So yeah, in some sense, the point is that capitalism is unnatural, that these people are all incredibly rich, but they don't actually have any skills that achieve anything. So in the state of nature of this desert island, suddenly, the working class are in the best position. And you know, there are some pretty on-the-nose moments, like there's this Russian businessman who is constantly quoting anti-capitalist thinkers criticizing capitalism, and then on the island, when suddenly this poor woman from the lower levels of the crew is actually the one who is the most competent, he's like, hey, have you heard of the mantra, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need? Yeah, the point is that these people who endorse capitalism as the most wonderful fair system would be the first to start advocating for socialism if they were the ones in the disadvantaged position. And there's a sort of broader relevance to Rawls's theory of social justice here, where if you ask people to imagine a situation where all classes in society could be repopulated at random, nobody would choose the class system we currently have. So yeah, all of this is really obvious, but my counter to that as a criticism would be, if it is so obvious, isn't it a bit weird that this film is the first time this idea is being explored directly in fiction? And doesn't that sort of justify this film as the first time these ideas are being explored? Like, yeah, it seems really obvious to come up with the idea of what if we went back to nature, where the valuable economic assets were in the hands of the poor rather than rich. But, well, if it's such an easy idea to come up with, then someone should probably make that movie. And they did. I'll also say that for me, this film is partially justified in being a little bit on the nose, in that it's kind of absurdist. In my mind, films that are really ham-fisted with their message are most annoying when they are trying to be serious dramas. Like, a serious drama about how the rich don't appreciate the poor would be pretty cringe, but this film is a black comedy. And that is exactly where I think having the message be pretty obvious makes a lot of sense, because the film isn't supposed to be serious. The characters aren't supposed to be believable. It's fine to have cliché archetypes in comedies. Now, the limitation here is that this film is only kind of absurdist. I think totally absurdist films can really be as on the nose as they like, because why not? There's no logic by which that shouldn't be the case. However, my issue is, with that said, I wish this film was a bit more absurdist. And the best example of this is the revelation that the whole time that they're stranded on this desert island experiencing all of this drama, it turns out they're actually walking distance from a luxury beach resort. So this feels like, okay, this film is supposed to be absurdist. The film is supposed to be silly. The point is these people are so incompetent that they didn't even think to just look along the coast to find this resort. And maybe there's a metaphor there for, in general, our unwillingness to conceive of how society could be different, which is obviously what this film is all about. So if this is supposed to be absurd and ridiculous, then it's fine that the film is lacking in subtlety. But the issue I have is that it's actually quite difficult to get to the resort. Like, they have to climb over this mountain to get there, so it makes sense they might not have explored that far. It's not clear how many days they're there for. It would be funnier and much better, in my view, if they were explicitly said to have been there for months, if not years, and the luxury resort is just literally the next beach over, and that, in being so funny, would justify this film as a comedy that's not supposed to be taken too seriously. So yeah, for me, that's something that would have made this film better. Anyway, in the end, the poor woman murders this rich influencer called Yaya so that she can keep this resort a secret and continue being in charge. It's actually a pretty good scene because she's going to murder her, then hesitates when Yaya says, "Hey, I can help you," but then she says, "You could be my assistant," and seals her fate. So a very nice dark ending. Although again, the fact the film flirts with being serious and realistic means, I don't know, it seems like this is just a temporary fix because we literally close with Yaya's boyfriend running to the resort himself, perhaps because he senses something bad is about to happen. Anyway, so yeah, that's all just to defend this film's over-the-top themes by saying, for the most part, it seems like the film is trying to be over the top. However, this brings me on to something really over the top, which is on the cruise ship there's a protracted scene where everyone gets food poisoning during a storm, so it's combined with seasickness too. I could explain the scene, but I don't want to. That's because I didn't watch it. See, I've seen this film before, and I knew about the scene in advance, and I don't know if my body was anticipating it or if I'm just under the weather, but I suddenly started feeling really nauseous just as we approached that scene. And I mean, I really did feel rather uncomfortable, and it was just before I was about to eat some food, so I thought to myself, I don't really want to be already feeling sick, trying to force down some food, and watching a bunch of other people sliding around in their own vomit and diarrhea. So I actually did just skip this entire scene, and it's quite a protracted scene, so I don't regret it, just offering up some honesty there. I have seen it before, and my memory is that it is an effective way of marking the transition from the rich being in charge of this cruise, to then, of course, things being switched when they're on the island. By the way, weirdly, it isn't the storm that causes them to need to flee the ship, but rather some pirates show up and take it over. Seems needlessly convoluted if you already have a storm, just have the boat capsize, right? Oh, one thing about the cruise. There is this drunk captain who constantly berates the wealthy patrons, refuses to do any of the formal social stuff on the ship, and doesn't like any aspect of fine dining. Maybe this can be excused as absurdism, but I'm not sure what the point of the absurdism is, because they are otherwise shown to be very diligent about catering to the wealthy elite. But then they have this particular captain, who clearly is not an appropriate person to be on this luxury cruise. There is one funny bit though, where a woman is complaining about the fact that the sails are dirty, and obviously you just take this as being that rich people are really pompous, they have incredibly high standards, they're really high maintenance, obviously no survival skills. But what's funny is when the captain, who's played by Woody Harrelson, is told this, and he just responds by saying, well, the issue there is that this is a motorized vessel. We don't have sails. And I just thought there was something so funny about how simply he delivered that line. But yeah, I skipped that, and now let's talk about what the film maybe should have skipped. Because so far, you're probably thinking I've pretty much described the entire plot of the movie, but actually there's a full hour before all of this that felt sort of unnecessary. Basically, Yaya and her boyfriend, a male model, are sort of main characters here, even if they become overshadowed by wider events later on. And we spend a significant amount of time just focused on their characters and their drama and all this stuff that ultimately doesn't matter. I get that this could be subversive and intentional, like the point is that it's an unconventional narrative where you think it will be a relationship drama about this random couple, but in the end a lot of their plot has very little payoff. But this film already has so much else going on that could be interesting to explore, so I don't really see the point in this where we see all of the drama between these two people. This film isn't super short and it actually does drag at times. The thing that is interesting is they explore some gender stuff, like they're talking earlier on about who should pay for the first date, men or women. Yaya is constantly weaponizing male attention to make her boyfriend jealous. And all of this is significant because by the end of the film, the poor crew member who has basically become the captain ends up establishing a one-man harem with Yaya's boyfriend. So then Yaya ends up getting really jealous, so my how the tables turn. But also there's a lot here going on with gender roles and how they've been reversed in this weird absurdist way. I mean, again, I can't stress this enough. This random old maid incorporates this young, attractive male model into her harem because she is the only one capable of catching fish, so she gives him fish when he has sex with her. So yeah, like with the whole class reversal thing, there is also a gender reversal thing. It is a bit silly that none of these fully grown men are remotely capable of defending themselves, and the film sort of contradicts the class point by having this one male member of the crew who is also incompetent. So yeah, whatever, the film isn't perfect, but I do like the way it explores some interesting themes, it explores them in an interesting way, and the fact it doesn't take itself too seriously means I really don't have a problem with it being a bit on the nose of its social commentary. Low 8 out of 10. Right, so next I watched Turning Red, which is a period drama, because it's about a girl who starts having her period. So actually it's about this girl who turns into a red panther when she hits puberty. The timing and colour scheme makes it pretty obvious it's an analogy for having a period. The only thing that makes me doubt that is they also explicitly mention having a period and needing period products, so I don't know, that's kind of confusing the metaphor. Either way, at times this film made me feel uncomfortable because it is about a 13-year-old girl's sexual awakening. There's a lot of implied feelings that emerge from her noticing boys. I guess I should acknowledge this movie is not for me. Like, usually I'd say that movies should be accessible to everyone, and I wouldn't excuse a movie just by saying it's for a different audience. But in the case of this movie, I mean, maybe it would be kind of good to watch for girls who are around that age in a way that is definitely not of much value for a 30-year-old man. But yeah, being old and joyless as I am, I did find this film pretty cringy. Like, all the times these girls just randomly start singing and dancing, but I actually think real-life girls are pretty cringy. My wife has shown me all these weird YouTube videos she made with her friends growing up, and I imagine now with TikTok that has gotten even worse. The other thing that's cringy about this, and also makes me think this movie definitely isn't for me, is that the mother in this movie is just an awful human being, like a genuine piece of human garbage. It's impossible to overstate how much she willfully embarrasses her daughter in a way I can only understand as a willful and spiteful effort to sabotage her social life. I say this isn't for me because my parents were like pretty chill, and they sort of instilled in me the belief that you can't really be a good parent when you're being a piece of shit to your kids. So, case in point, this girl, May I think is her name, she has a crush on a boy. So she draws pictures of this boy she likes with her kissing him, and her mum goes around to see the boy in front of all his friends and shows him the pictures. She also shows up at school and shouts in front of everyone that May forgot her menstrual pads. Like, she's not stupid. She doesn't have a mental disorder. There's no reason to think she doesn't understand what everyone immediately would be able to understand, that doing such a thing would massively embarrass your child and cause them huge social issues in terms of fitting in. So I can only surmise that she doesn't care or actively wants to hurt her daughter. And I think it's kind of gross. This movie sort of normalizes what she's doing by just acting like, oh dear, how awkward, this mum is so embarrassing. She's not embarrassing, she's an evil person. I said this movie might be good for kids to watch, but at the same time, I think I'd have to tell my kids that I believe parenting is about respect and love and caring for your child, so I don't want them to think that what they're seeing in this movie actually constitutes a legitimate form of parenting. You know, I wouldn't want them to worry that their parents, who are supposed to love them, could ever do something so brazenly cruel and pointlessly destructive to their lives. The good news is, it turns out that her mother is only like this because her mother in turn was like this to her, so it's generational trauma. I like generational trauma because, you know, it's horrible people being treated horribly. It sort of retroactively justifies everything. Like, if there's an abusive person and then like, yeah, my parents were abusive to me, well, good. At least now I don't have to feel bad for you about that. Thanks for being such a jerk that I can now sleep easy knowing that at least in your case, being abused was entirely deserved because you suck. Oh wait, I didn't even mention it. We see this has a real impact on May. After her mother shows the pictures to the boy she has a crush on, she says some really troubling things about like how she shouldn't have expressed her sexuality. Like, she pretty much says, how could you have imagined those disgusting things and had those sick, shameful thoughts? Dude, that's not okay. And yeah, the movie ends with the mother and daughter reconciling, but like, not in a remotely satisfying way. In fact, I think there's nothing more to it than, oh, her mum has a troubled relationship with her mum too. But that's not an excuse. That's an excuse if you're a baby. But if you're an adult, take some accountability. I'm not accepting, but my parents were mean to me as a valid reason to abuse your kid. With this said, shockingly, there was one moment where I kind of agreed with the mum. Shocking, but yeah, for the middle of the film, she's kind of reasonable. See, essentially, the logic with the red panda is that she turns into one when she is highly stressed emotionally. In a month, they'll be able to get rid of it, but in the meantime, the more she turns into the panda, the more destructive it will get, and the harder it will be to turn back. The origin story for the red panda is one of her ancestors used it as a murder weapon to kill an entire army of soldiers back in ancient China. Seems pretty serious, and like she does need to get rid of it. But she wants to go to a concert to see a boy band, and the mother is like, no, because that could emotionally overstimulate her, and that would be bad when she could just wait another month. Now, I think the mother has a good reason, but to vindicate her further, all of her friends' parents also say no. So it seems like there's agreement that these 13-year-olds shouldn't be going to see this boy band, because the concert tickets, by the way, are $200 each. But they decide to go anyway, and to earn enough money, they decide to monetize turning into the red panda regularly so that they can take selfies of people. But like, we were just told that repeatedly turning into the red panda can have permanent life-changing effects. So that's incredibly reckless to just be repeatedly changing into the red panda to earn money. And then later on, she suddenly decides she's done it too much and is scared to do it even just one more time, as if she hasn't been doing it on a whim for the rest of the film. By the way, it's also weird that like not everyone knows about the panda thing by the end of this. Do kids not gossip in this world? Anyway, so then her final crazy move is that she backs out of the ritual so that she can go to the concert, which causes her mum to get really mad at her. So she twerks her mother to death, and they all live happily ever after. Her dad is actually pretty chill. The conclusion is that being a red panda actually isn't a bad thing at all, which I guess makes the film feel pretty pointless. For the most part, this whole film just feels pretty pointless. Like, there's not really much of a plot to it apart from just trying to get to a concert, and the mother-daughter relationship morally offends me. In fact, based on that alone, middling 3. I don't know if I can endorse a movie that presents such a toxic relationship as a basis for a fun coming-of-age story. Right, so the movie Close is about two boys who are close until their friendship comes to a close. It's also decidedly a story of two halves, so I'll have to take it as such. See, the first thing I jotted down right away is, are they gay? Because these boys, who I guess are maybe 12, something like that, do everything together, and are often getting very close physically. Now, I like Moonlight. I like Call Me By Your Name. These characters are a little younger, so please, France, if you could just one time avoid child porn, then that would be good. But I'm still interested to see this relationship develop. But actually, one of the guys gets a bit insecure about the idea that they're gay, so he starts acting more manly and playing sports, and he pushes the other guy away. Now, I'll admit, at this point, I found the film interesting because I really related to it. I had this friend in primary school who I was super close with, and yeah, I think he got a bit annoyed about the limitation of having just one really close friend instead of a wider friend group, so he started playing football at lunch at a time when I had no interest in football at all, and I ended up hanging out with a group of nerd kids who would play like Pokemon and stuff. The strange thing is I don't actually remember it being an especially large drama at the time. Even though we were close friends, he just went off and did his own thing, I did my thing, we were both happy, and I think we ultimately ended up eventually going back to being very close friends. But yeah, having had that experience, I found this interesting. In a way, it's a little bit like Banshees of Inisherin, except in this case, we know exactly why the two are having a drama with each other. It's because people think they're gay, and one of them doesn't like that. I know I complained about mums in the last section, but I have to say the mum here is really annoying, because she starts like grilling the kid about what's wrong, and why he's sad, while his friend is still there. What is it with mums being totally oblivious to how not to embarrass their kids? I remember one time I had a drama with a girlfriend, and my dad asked me if everything was okay, after she left. You know, he intentionally waited because imagine how awkward it would be to start asking me why I seemed in a bad mood while my girlfriend is still with me. Definitely at least as ridiculous to be asking that question while someone's best friend is still with them. Anyway, I should name these kids. So there's a blonde one called Leo, who is the person who's more insecure about them being considered gay, and is trying to move away from this other kid called Remy. So yeah, Leo keeps moving away from Remy and trying to make new friends, and this eventually leads to a physical confrontation. I have to say, I was really interested in this subtle and relatable conflict around how friendships can fall apart, and also, you know, how expectations of masculinity can tear apart emotionally fulfilling relationships. There's a lot of deep thematic and emotional stuff here. And I was also interested in, are they gay? You know, how is this film going to resolve that tension? Will they be comfortable being less joined at the hip? Will they go back to being best friends? Will they fall out entirely? Or will this end with a romantic confession of love? I was really interested in where this was going to go. And then Remy killed himself. So yeah, this is the second half of the movie, and for me it is a distinct downgrade because it's just a much less subtle conflict that bulldozes over the much more interesting and nuanced dynamic already in place. It's also unrealistic to me how they handle it. Like, firstly, rather than letting the kids go home and calling the parents letting them know, they instead bring all the kids into school with an emergency announcement, and the kids find out right away that Remy is dead. Also, it's a bit weird that there's no indication that Leo gets any time off of school after his best friend has just died. He's still going to school in scenes before the funeral. And there's other weird things, like they're just clearing out his locker in the middle of the school day. I am absolutely certain that is something that a real school would do after the students had all left. There's also some trauma indicated by the fact that he wets himself one night, but yeah, overall he weirdly doesn't seem super sad. The best bit is when he gets annoyed at everyone else reminiscing about Remy and challenges them on how they know anything about him. Obviously the initial point was that Remy was really close to Leo and Leo was trying to make more friends, but Remy never had any interest in making other friends, so the implication would be that only Leo really knows much about him. So yeah, it does make it more sad knowing that this kid is dead and he only really had one friend. And all this culminates with the end of the film where Leo tearfully confesses to Remy's mother that they had a fight the day before the incident, and obviously he blames himself based on that. Fair enough, I get that Leo would feel that way, but from an outsider's perspective, it's pretty obvious mentally healthy kids don't kill themselves because they had one argument with a friend. Like, pretty clearly this kid had a lot of other issues going on if he decided to do this. In fact, they do cleverly suggest that by having the mother earlier on say that Remy isn't allowed to lock the bathroom door. And later on, the confirmation Leo gets that he is dead is that he goes around his house and looks through the window, where he sees the bathroom door broken, implying it's been kicked open. We can infer that Remy had in the past tried to do something dangerous in the bathroom, and his parents were aware of that, but this time he actually succeeded. Either way, let me just say this now. In my view, this movie emphatically loses momentum in the second half. The first half was really interesting with this conflict over this awkward sort of asymmetrical friendship, complicated by homophobic expectations of masculinity. There were so many directions they could have gone in the second half that would have been really emotionally interesting, but in the end they went for something that feels cliche. There are so many movies about suicide and people struggling to move on after a friend takes their life. This movie went from exploring a relatable experience I've never seen any other film really touch on before, to the much more trite, played out, generic grief meets guilt surviving a dead friend story that has been done to death in so many other dramas. And I'm not sure how to rate this film. Many possible second halves that followed on from the first could have seen this film get even a 9 out of 10, but certainly at least in the 7 range. However, the fact that the second half totally fumbles actively annoys me, and therefore makes my overall opinion negative, which would suggest less than a 5 out of 10. I guess I have to somewhat split the difference and give this film like a middling 6. It's just such a shame because the film really isn't in any meaningful sense a 6. It's a really good first half dragged down by a disappointing second half, and that just averages out to make the film much less than it should be. So next I watched The Living, and similar to Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris, this is the type of British movie that comes on TV and the whole family watches it and has a jolly good time. Suffice it to say, that's not always the case for a lot of other types of films that get nominated for Oscars. But this film is quite a simple story about a man who discovers he is going to die from cancer within 6 months. Theretofore, he hasn't really achieved much in his life, so he endeavours to do something that will make him enjoy his final few months. He starts off by hanging out with this degenerate who has done all sorts of drugs and travelled the world and indulged his pleasures. He goes with him to this degenerate place and they have some fun. They also meet another Jamaican woman. These movies about Britain in the past just love their Jamaicans. But yeah, you think the movie will be about this older man learning through the younger guy how to have a good time, especially since he has a pretty cold relationship with his actual son. This guy could be like his adoptive son. But actually, not long into the film, he seems to, I can only assume, get overwhelmed by the degeneracy of it all during a burlesque show, and he ends up departing and we never see the young man again. So it seems like this will be more of an episodic movie where he searches in different places for meaning, reminiscent of the Book of Ecclesiastes. Except next he meets this girl and basically has a nice time with her, but weirdly there's not like a singular point to what he's getting out of it. Like in the previous part, it's obvious the question is, can you derive meaning from base pleasure? And the answer is no. I suppose with this woman, the question is whether he can derive pleasure from human connection, and people even suspect that he is having an inappropriate relationship with this much younger woman, but he doesn't really. There is some good dialogue here as he talks about his life and makes a really interesting analogy between a child who is sad to come in after playtime and a hypothetical child who doesn't enjoy playtime in the first place. It's interesting in that counterintuitively it suggests a life well lived is one you are reluctant to depart. I actually would view my life as having been well lived if when I'm called home I'm very happy with being decidedly at the end of things. Anyway, that analogy is appropriate because his third and final solution for how to live a good life is to actually commit to his job at the council and specifically help a group of mothers to put up a playground in a disused bit of land. This is interesting in that typically people committing to their jobs is seen as a bad thing for their life, but he realizes actually he can get value from his job as long as he uses it to do good. What's strange though is shortly after making this decision he dies at just over an hour into the movie. What we then see is his former colleagues slowly realizing the point in how he was living his last months. They thought he was crazy, but as they reflect on all the things he did in pursuit of building this playground, they realized the effort was commendable. They decide to commit to doing a better job at working in the future and take their role as civil servants seriously, which is funny of course considering the council in fact has a reputation for being pretty rubbish. And unsurprisingly, the next scene shows that they haven't followed through on this as they still ignore a lot of their work. There's a point made right at the beginning that they like to keep their stack of paperwork high so people add less work to the pile than if it seems empty. The point is the system disincentivizes working too hard and instead glorifies putting things off. There is one worker who has taken things seriously, and he goes to the playground and reflects on the life of this man, whereupon he meets a police officer who tells him a story. That on the night he died, the policeman saw him swinging on the swings in the park. Despite the fact it was freezing cold, he was going to bring him indoors, but thought he looked so happy and peaceful on the swing that he decided to let him be, and later that night he died. They conclude this was in fact the right move, as presumably he must have died happy. And I'm tearing up as I'm writing down that conclusion because it really is rather beautiful, very sweet. But I do have two criticisms of the film overall. I feel like the opening two quests for meaning sort of felt pointless, like there wasn't really anything they were leading up to, and as such they were mostly just filler. I also feel the film doesn't have a fantastic theme. Like, I guess the real conclusion is just leave something behind that is valuable and people will remember you fondly, which, yeah, but that's pretty basic. This does make me think perhaps the message is that you should take your job seriously and view it as a means of helping others, which is a nice idea, although tough for the people whose jobs are necessary, but unlikely to leave anything amounting to a lasting monument. Even undeniably valuable jobs like being a binman, you can spend your final months of life doing that and taking pleasure in knowing you're helping people, but nobody's ever going to think, man, I'll never forget that bin man. What a hero. So yeah, the point is overall the story is nice, but pretty basic. I think I enjoyed the emotion of it, but that's mostly because it ends strong in terms of emotion, but I have to view the film holistically, and it wasn't fantastic for the first half. I would love to give this film a low 7 because I feel like I do so often give 6s, but unfortunately 7 is reserved for films with a bit more rewatch value, and this doesn't really have that. So I'll have to be a high 6. Right, so next I watched Tell It Like a Woman, and the thing about this is while I was looking it up on Google just to see where I could watch it, I happened to catch a glimpse of the IMDb score, which was 3.7 out of 10. That is a phenomenally low rating for IMDb. In fact, at the time, I didn't see it clearly and thought, well, maybe it was just a random website that looks like IMDb that Google was showing the rating from, but really it's just a small website where they only got a few reviews and some random misogynist rated it a 1 out of 10 just for having women in it. Even still though, this made me realise the film can't be that good because even misogynists won't hate a movie just for having a woman in it if it's actually a really good movie. So I went into this movie apprehensive, knowing that a film that is nominated for an Oscar could be nominated in a category that has very little to do with the overall quality of the film. So yeah, we start off with this drug addict in prison who's going to rehab in order to get out of prison. Already it does look kind of cheap and overacted, but there was one thing I liked. To represent this woman's paranoia, they show a different version of her talking to the camera about all the things she's paranoid about while she is trying to, be chill. It is kind of crazy though, that even after having made apparently so much progress that they are letting her out of prison, she is still so paranoid that she thinks the people driving her to the halfway house are going to kill her, and she is considering how she might kill them. But yeah, whatever. I was, I guess, pretty interested in the plot of where this drug addict's life was going and how she was going to recover. And then some woman just walks onto the scene and is like, that was me, but then I worked to get back on track and recovered. And a message flashes up like, this organization helps people recover from drug addiction. This was one of their stories. We then cut to Cara Delevingne playing a homeless woman. I honestly can't ever imagine her playing a homeless woman. She just has intensely upper class energy, but whatever. And Melissa McCarthy is trying to remove some clothes from her because she's a doctor and she has an infection that needs cleaning up. So she's wearing a comically large number of layers, I guess because it's cold, even though it's LA, so how cold does it get? After removing all the layers, they see she has a cut, and they bandage it up. Melissa McCarthy then says, that was the stinkiest job I've ever done in my life. And then it flashes up a message saying, many nurses worked hard to take care of homeless people during the pandemic. Well done them. So you probably noticed a few things by now. Firstly, that I'm not actually telling you verbatim what the messages were, that's just the gist. Secondly, that this is an anthology film where we see different people's stories. Thirdly, that these are anthology films about real-life people and organizations. Fourthly, that they are supposed to be about different facets of society. And fifthly, most importantly, The stories are incredibly substanceless. Like literally, I cannot stress this enough. The entire story here is that they help a homeless woman remove a comically high number of layers of clothing, and then bandage up her wound, and then comment on how stinky she was. The only slightly interesting thing here is that because it's during COVID, the homeless people get to stay in hotels because there's not much traveling allowed, and I didn't know that was a thing. Lucky them. But yeah, here's the really weird thing. Despite those first two stories having a very similar format, the rest of the stories don't. I don't know, it just seems weird to have two very similar types of stories right at the beginning that you'd think it's setting up a pattern, but actually it's not at all. See, next we have the story of this Italian woman played by Eva Longoria. She finds out that her sister has died and that she's supposed to adopt her niece now that she's dead. However, she doesn't want to do this because she's a busy career woman. We get this really on-the-nose dialogue where she says, "I don't know what's going to come of her, it's not my responsibility," when she's just in the other room. In the end, the daughter tries to leave the island on a ferry, but Eva Longoria rushes to rescue her and then says, "Hey, okay, I guess I'll take care of you," then it's over. The next establishes a commitment to racial diversity because it's a week in the life of this Asian single mother. We see her stressful routine as she struggles to take care of her two kids while also working a tough menial job. However, after the week is over, the kids reveal that they were working on a competition to win a robotic vacuum cleaner to help her with the work. Fortunately, earlier on, we had a line of dialogue where she said she needs to vacuum every day because it gets so messy. So she then thanks her kids and tears up over how considerate it was of them to win this gift for her, and selflessly focus on getting a prize that's just to make her life easier. This one is actually reasonably sweet, even though it's still just incredibly basic as all these stories have been. Next we get another Italian, and I mean, they should have made Eva Longoria actually Mexican, and then they'd be more consistent with the racial diversity. The story here is this woman works as a vet, and this couple brings in a dog that's been injured, but the woman subtly shows the vet that she has bruises, which she indicates came from her boyfriend. What's weird is it implies she intentionally injured her dog by stabbing it in the paw so that she could see the vet, but like, does she never see anyone else who she could talk to? Aside from anything else, why can't she just leave? Did she really have to stab this perfectly innocent dog in the paw like a psycho? The issue of this story is it's way too simplistic in terms of how it presents domestic abuse, because the solution is just that the security guard apprehends the man and then they call the police. If solving domestic abuse was as simple as indicating to someone you've been injured, and then they just call the police and the police immediately arrest the guy and hold him indefinitely so he's not a threat to you, well then nobody would get abused. There is nothing more to this than abused woman shows evidence of abuse to another woman, and then immediately this woman jumps into action and the guy is apprehended and she's perfectly safe now. That's not how it actually works. The only way this would make sense is if the guy wasn't her boyfriend and was just a kidnapper holding a captive, but then why would he take her to the vet? It makes no sense. Anyway, the next story is about this Indian woman, so we're back on the diversity thing. Within 1 minute of the story starting, someone attempts to rape her, India. But yeah, the film gets a bit artsy as she has this fantasy about this random guy where they're dancing together in the middle of a busy intersection. And then she decides to go speak to a trans prostitute, but they just have a cup of tea together and then they also dance. I don't even know what the point of this story was at all. Like, what was the logical through line from attempted rape to fantasizing about some random unrelated guy who I think was a security guard, to then just going to hang out with a trans prostitute? Make it make sense. And then what really made this ridiculous is that they play this really cheesy, cliche, breathy pop rock song that sounds like Ellie Goulding or something, and it just doesn't fit with the tone of the short at all. And then the final short is just two animated women dancing with each other. The animation is pretty good, but I think it lasted no more than 5 minutes, so no plot actually happened. They just danced to the music. Okay, let me rank the shorts from best to worst. Best is The Week in the Life of an Asian Mum, then the animated one just because it was somewhat visually interesting, then probably the drug addict black woman, then the Indian woman one, then the stinky homeless woman one, then the adoptive mother one, and worst is the abuse one. The thing the worst two ones have in common is they feel like Jarman sketches. They're just such simplistic try I'd expect to see them as AI videos on YouTube titled like, "New Mother Loves Child, #heartbreaking, #inspirational, and Abuse Victim Rescued by Bystander, #powerful. I also would stress again, it's crazy how inconsistent the focus and style was of these movies. The fact you think it will have a particular focus to the shorts based on the first two being consistent, but then it just becomes a free-for-all. And because there's no consistency, there's nothing I can say holistically, except that taken holistically, this barely qualifies as a movie because there's no relation between anything. The very best short was the Asian mum one, and even that one was still pretty average. It cleared the basic hurdle of having an emotional through line, but it was still super simplistic. Overall, I don't really want to talk about this movie much anymore, so let's just say middling too. Right, so next, and penultimately, I watched an animated movie called The Sea Beast.
Basically, it's about this fantasy kingdom where there are many different giant sea-dwelling creatures, and there are people whose job is to hunt these creatures, commissioned by this one trading empire. Now, I want you to imagine what would be the most obvious cliche baby's first kid movies plot-ass faux twist this movie could possibly... Yeah, that's right. Turns out actually the beasts are good. Basically, the rulers of the kingdom have just been pretending that the sea beasts present a serious threat, so they can, control the people with fear, I guess monopolize trade too. It's a bit weird that something else they mention is that the next big thing they need to do is venture to the outer ocean where things get even more dangerous, but then they never actually do that. I wonder if there's a plan for a sequel. Speaking of danger and outer ocean, I should say, my personal experience of this movie was adversely affected because I suffer from thalassophobia, which is, for those who don't know, fear of the deep ocean and the Lovecraftian horrors that might lurk within the ocean. Basically, everything this film's about. There are a lot of bird's eye shots of ships with giant, ominous shadows moving beneath them. There are even some underwater shots where you can just see giant figures lurking in the inky black deep. I'm making myself get anxious just talking about it, so suffice it to say that I could only stand to look at these scenes for a short while, and eventually I just had to look away. So there were some scenes, especially action scenes of fighting the beast, that I was unable to watch. Having said that, because the beasts end up being revealed to be friendly, they stop being presented as a threat, and from that point onwards I didn't have a problem. Anyway, let me talk about the characters. The first is this young girl who loves the idea of being a hunter, and she stows away on a ship so she can be part of that lifestyle. Her parents were both killed in a hunting expedition, but she is eventually able to accept that whatever creature killed them probably did so in self-defense. Even though they actually do establish that there are some giant sea creatures that do present a genuine threat to humans, like this one giant lobster monster that tries to eat the main characters. But whatever, the main one you're trying to hunt isn't actually a threat, and in fact animated to be incredibly cute. So much so it's ridiculous that it takes people any time at all to realise it's not a threat, considering how many people end up stranded in the water next to it, and it doesn't do anything to hurt them. Anyway, then there's a middle-aged man who doesn't like that this girl is hanging around and finds her annoying, but they end up stranded together on an island, so they have to work together. It's a pretty standard dynamic. Hardened man forced to hang out with an annoying, enthusiastic girl, and they end up forming an unlikely friendship. The man is himself the protege of an even older man who plans to leave the ship to him, and this guy is annoying because the film ends with him just being obsessed with killing this beast that presents no threat. And he even starts having a sword fight with the younger guy, but there isn't any remotely sufficient characterization to show why he's willing to fight this guy to the death just because he says the beast doesn't present a threat. It just comes across as very underdeveloped, as he's crazy and driven man with hatred, but why? Oh wait, I almost forgot to mention this even more stupid moment happens where rather than killing this beast he's been hunting his entire life, he decides to pull out the poison arrow before it's fully filled up with poison so that he can bring it alive to the king and queen, just to then kill it in front of them. Stupid. Anyway, I will say that the animation is pretty fun. I like the design for the major city. It just looked really awesome, so well done there. There's also this really cool looking monster hunting ship that just gets totally destroyed the first time it's in action, but at least it looks cool. The main thing that holds this movie back for me is just how obviously cliche the threat actually isn't a threat at all thing is in these animated movies. I've seen it so many times. The monster isn't a monster, the real monster is humanity. And that alone knocks this down, but at least it's moderately entertaining. Low 6. Right, and now it's time for the Best Picture winner itself, Everything Everywhere All at Once. So this is an example of where my opinion on a film has changed quite significantly in having watched it more than once, and one of the films that makes me think it would be best if I were to watch all these films more than once before reviewing them. See, the thing is, in my first viewing, I knew the title of this film, and I also knew everyone really liked it. So I thought the film would be really crazy, and it would set up this really complicated logic, but it would all come together in a satisfying way. That's the key thing missing that I wanted. One of those films that feels like it had to be written in an Excel spreadsheet. There's so much to keep track of, and like a perfect equation, all the logic comes together in one perfect conclusion. This might seem like a high standard, but it was based on me knowing the film was very ambitious with its concept and was well received. And as I learned more about the concept, my expectations grew. Pretty early on, you discover that this is a world where there are multiple dimensions, and you can access different aspects of your alternate selves by breaking the barriers between dimensions. And you do this by just doing really strange, bizarre things you wouldn't ordinarily do. I really like that concept in particular. It makes me think of the whole idea that you could prove free will by doing something so bizarre. It means you must have freely chosen it, because how could something so bizarre have been determined? Honestly, I might well prefer the employment of this concept in a movie more directly about free will, because that's where I hear this idea of doing random acts as a way of breaking some
metaphysical truth of the universe employed rather than dimensions. So yeah, you can already see this aspect of me being really interested in the concept, but feeling like it could be woven into this much more sophisticated metaphysics for the logic of the film. And then by the time you get to the end of the film, really none of the logic they set up is woven into that conclusion. Like for the last 20 minutes or so, they pretty much abandon all the rules they set up. I don't mean they get contradicted or anything, I just mean they are entirely absent from the conclusion. The actual conclusion is just that she reconciles with her daughter on an emotional level, and that solves the conflict of the film, but it makes a lot of the mechanics of how the universe works feel pointless. And yes, that still does bother me and does knock down my rating of the film. However, something I was able to appreciate this time is that this film is still pretty crazy in a way that honestly is incredibly entertaining and funny. Probably the most famous scene is where a bunch of characters are fighting over needing to put a butt plug inside their butt as a way to break through the metaphysical walls of the multiverse as previously established. Since the way you break down these walls is by doing bizarre things, a lot of these jumps are funny, but this is easily the one that is the most unapologetically ridiculous in a way you just have to respect. Some of the universes themselves are funny, like a universe where everyone has hot dog fingers, and also earlier on she gets Ratatouille confused with a made-up movie called Raccacoonie, which is the same but with a raccoon instead of a rat. And then she enters a universe where people do have raccoons on their head controlling their actions like in Ratatouille. And in this one fight scene she brings that guy to her universe and jumps on his head and starts controlling him as part of the fight scene. That kind of stuff is brilliant. It's a setup disguised in the form of just a mum being bad in her knowledge of Pixar movies, but then reincorporated as a joke and then actually employed as a viable mechanic within an action scene. If the whole movie was like this, I would love it. I also find it really funny that the center of the multiverse is this thing called the everything bagel, and it's like a joke about how an everything bagel is a type of bagel with lots of different seasoning. But the point is that here it is literally an everything bagel. That's all very good. Again, it's absurd, but there's a logic to it, and that's what makes things funny to me. I will say though that yeah, cool, it's funny and everything, but I wish I understood the logic of the movie a little better, because absurdism is funny when it's anchored to some logic, otherwise it just starts feeling like poor writing. See, the big question is how exactly does going through these multiverses give them special powers? What we're shown is that it's because different versions of yourself have different powers, but a lot of them just seem very underpowered. Like she accesses this version of herself who's a singer so that she can hold her breath for a long time, but then she also has a karate fight, and like, does this version of her who's a singer also know karate? On that note, there is a version of her who just straight up does know karate, and I'm thinking, couldn't she just be the karate version of her all the time? That would seem to confer the most benefit. There are very few moments where her knowing karate wouldn't solve all the problems. There is this idea that because she's the most neutral, underachieving version of herself, that means she has access to all these other versions because she's a blank slate. But again, why does she need all these versions? I feel like it would be better if Matrix style it was just the case that transcending the multiverse gave you powers simply because it gives you the ability to go beyond and in some way manipulate the physical universe, thus giving you superpowers not due to a specific version of yourself you're accessing, but the very fact you're between dimensions. I will also say that it's a bit confusing how the alternate universes themselves even work, because early on they set it up the standard way of being the result of different choices branching off from each other. But there are clearly universes with totally different everything. Like there's one universe where they are animated, another where they are pinatas, another where they are sentient rocks. Honestly, I wish they'd just lean into this idea that the multiverses contain all possible realities, but they didn't say that. They said it contains all possible choices that could be made in our existing universe. And those two things are very different because no possible choice in this universe could cause it to become animated or cause non-sentient objects to gain sentience. Anyway, with all that said, I should say the action is pretty entertaining, but not fantastic, and there are very few moments that are mind-bending in the way you might expect from being trans-dimensional. There is a cool fight at the beginning with a fanny pack, which works pretty well, but I struggle to remember any really creative subsequent fights. I guess the overall point of the story is an emotional climax, although weirdly for me, the more I try to think about it, the less it lands. Like, there is an idea of emotional catharsis, but I struggle to identify the substance of what is actually happening emotionally. Case in point, in the main universe, Evelyn, the main character's husband, wants a divorce, and in general he's a bit of a beta cuck. Their marriage is loveless and she is too focused on the business while he is too focused on avoiding conflict. The basic conflict is that somehow, in seeing lots of other universes of her husband, she decides to fix their marriage, and at the end we see them passionately kiss, but again, the logic here doesn't make much sense to me. Like, what is the actual thing that connects I've seen loads of other versions of my husband to I am now attracted to this specific version? Especially since still very much towards the end of the movie, she's still putting down her husband for being an incompetent loser because she thinks he's just making things worse with the government official who has a problem with their tax return. And even after the official is like, oh, okay, I'll let you off after whatever her husband says, she still goes after her and is like, I'm so sorry for whatever stupid idiot thing my stupid moron husband said to you. And this is all happening within the last 20 minutes of the movie. So my question is, what exactly causes her to go from hating her husband so much even after she's seen the positive results of him talking to someone, she still assumes he must have said something stupid that warrants damage control, to then being so in love with him by the end? Similarly, she has a beef with her daughter. I will say she's not as bad as the mum from Turning Red, but she is just as Chinese. But yeah, whatever. It's everything you can imagine from a Chinese mum. She pushes her daughter too hard to succeed while being hypercritical and have conservative traditionalist objections to her daughter's lesbian lifestyle. And again, on some level, the emotional catharsis just seems to be after fighting this multi-dimensional crusade, she's left thinking her daughter being a lesbian isn't actually that much of a problem because she has a much wider perspective. But then weirdly, again, within the last 20 minutes of the film, even after she has accepted her daughter as a lesbian, the daughter is still really mad at her, and the mum just gives this kind of incoherent speech about like how she'd love her in all possible universes, and then that solves the problem. I don't know, to me the emotional progression in this film feels very tell don't show. Like, we establish the issues she has with her husband and her daughter, and we see some stuff that might lead to a change in her attitude, but then we also see their relationship issues still aren't resolved until right at the end they're just like, okay, we're friends now. Having said that, there is a very cute scene in the Sentient Rock universe where we see the mother and the daughter have a conversation in complete silence through text that is interesting both aesthetically and emotionally. Overall, I do think this film could have benefited from a few more drafts of the story, because there are a lot of really interesting ideas, but it almost seems like they stop short of bringing it together in a perfect way. Whether it's the lack of consistency around how the universe works, or the lack of clarity around how exactly the emotional journey in terms of Evelyn's interpersonal relationships progresses, I definitely do have that sense at the end of this film of being like, oh, that's it. And that is why the first time I watched this, I rated this a 6 out of 10. But the difference is, for whatever reason, now knowing the end, I am much more able to appreciate the fun in the moment of just how crazy this film is. Like, yeah, I know that ultimately I'm a bit disappointed with where it all ends up leading, and to be perfectly honest, I got a little bit bored during the conclusion to the film itself. But looking back at the majority of the film, I wasn't bored at all. I was having a great time, and I have to give credit to the film for the really unique concept and the fact it introduced all these awesome ideas. So yeah, actually, this film gets quite a glow up, and for all the really interesting ideas, I'm going to give this a low 8 out of 10. And that's mostly because I like filmmaking to exist as an art, and all the ways this film is so creative allows it to be really artistic, even if I don't love the plot. But it's not all about plot, so well done. Still not the best picture of the year, of course, which is the accolade it received. What was the best picture of the year? I can't remember all my ratings. Okay, I checked, so I gave Top Gun Maverick and Banshees of Ed Sheeran both a high 8, and if I had to choose which of those is the better movie, probably Banshees. So yeah, Banshees is the best film of the year. Still, quite embarrassing for 2022 that there isn't a single film that I would consider a 9 or above. Anyway, everyone, I guess that's the end of this video. So for the second half of this video, obviously this is part 2, but the second half of this part 2, I have had a cold for a while, and obviously this is a lot of talking, so that was not fun for me. I just had to power through because it was getting, it was taking its time. That I hadn't yet made any progress. Goodness me, let's try making sentences work. So yeah, that's that. I'll see you all for the second Academy Award, which I'll be doing soon. Bye.